Chapter 501. Yin Yang walked over quickly and grabbed Xiao Jinhan's hand. Without a word, he cultivated the endless divine art and slowly transferred the overflowing vitality into old Marshal Qiu's body. Only then did he begin to inspect Xiao Jinhan's current injuries in detail. Yin Yang could not help sucking in a breath of cold air even though he was a veteran of the battlefield. The old marshal had taken the lead, not avoiding danger. There were indeed many wounds on his body, but more than 90% of them were flesh wounds. Other than having Bai Yishu as protection, the old marshal's cultivation base was extraordinary as well, so it was not a big deal that he had not sustained any other serious injuries. There was only one fatal injury that had caused him to fall into such a state, but this one serious injury was enough to kill him. The arrow had been shot at the vital point of his left chest, piercing through his front and back. If one were to look at it from the surface, the wound could be said to have gone straight through his heart. How could a careless man be so fortunate? Fortunately, Yin Yang knew that Bai Yishu had managed to block the sudden fatal arrow at the last moment when it was about to hit its target. It was fortunate that the slight delay had caused the arrow to deviate a little when it pierced Xiao Jinhan's chest. Just a little, just a little. Otherwise, Xiao Jinhan would have died on the spot. Even so, Xiao Jinhan was still hovering on the edge of life and death. Perhaps, it could be said that half of his foot was already in the jaws of death, and it would be difficult for him to turn back. Even when Yin Yang saw it now, he was not confident. Yin Yang tried his best to save Xiao Jinhan, but after an hour of cultivating the endless divine art, Xiao Jinhan's injuries did not seem to improve at all. The endless divine art that Yin Yang had high hopes for and had always been successful seemed to have lost its effect today. Even the rate of his pulse did not increase, not even by a little. Xiao Jinhan was still lying in silence like before, but Yin Yang could clearly feel that the old marshal's remaining vitality was slipping away bit by bit. It was as if life no longer belonged to this old and severely injured body. Of course, Yin Yang was unwilling to give up just like that. Other than continuing to cultivate the endless divine art, he had also used all the superior spiritual medicine and superior medicine he had. However, this could only slightly slow down the loss of Xiao Jinhan's vitality. It could not actually stop it. At this moment, Yin Yang was filled with extreme hatred. He hated himself for losing the Nine Supreme's power at such a crucial moment. He hated himself even more for not being able to open his own divine sense space even though his cultivation had already recovered. If he could open up the space and restore his connection with Emi, Xiao Jinhan could be saved with Emi's air of vitality. With Emi's help, even if the old marshal had breathed his last breath, Yin Yang was confident that he could save him as long as it did not take long. In spite of this, Yin Yang could only watch as his most respected elder slowly passed away in front of him. He could do nothing but sigh helplessly. The frustration of being powerless but unable to do anything almost drove Yin Yang mad. Behind him, everyone watched Yin Yang's rescue in silence. Everyone held their breaths, afraid that the slightest movement would disturb Yin Yang. Everyone's eyes were gleaming with hope. They hoped that Yin Yang could create another legend and save the old marshal. Fu Baogua, Marquis Yun, Wang Dinghua, Shangguan Lingxiu, Bai Yishu, the four noble young masters, everyone here shared the same thought, but in the end, they could only see Yin Yang's back, which had always been as straight as a sword, slowly slumping, as if he had lost all his strength and could no longer continue. How is the old marshal? Is he getting better? Fu Baogua's voice was filled with anxiety. When he asked this question that was meant to test Yin Yang's luck, his heart sank instead. He had already seen the glaring wound on Xiao Jinhan's body. This kind of injury was a fatal injury, a serious injury that could not be cured. No matter how profound his cultivation base was, he would still die from such a grievous injury. There was no chance of a fluke. The reason why the old marshal was still alive was because he still had a breath left in him. If this breath was gone, he could die at any moment. The dim and radiant path was different. Marquis Yun, Bai Yishu, and the others looked extremely grim. Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes were already glistening with tears. Her eyes were glued to Yin Yang's face. Among everyone present, other than Feng Mafei, only Shangguan Lingxiu knew Yun Yang's real identity. Initially, Shangguan Lingxiu had pinned all her hopes on him. To her, there should be nothing in this world that the 9 Supremes Lords could not do. Take today's battle for example. Their side had fallen into a hopeless situation, but Yun Yang's arrival had turned the tables, opening a path of survival in the midst of death. The counterattack from breaking the siege was immediate. In spite of this, everyone could see Yun Yang's dilemma. Shangguan Lingxiu still hoped that Yun Yang could say that there was hope for the old marshal to survive. If even Yun Yang could not do anything about it, then there would be no turning back. Yun Yang knelt in silence, his face pale and his gaze dull. Suddenly, he spat out a mouthful of blood. Yun Yang's injury had not fully healed. His hasty journey had already violated the taboo of an injured person. Then, he had charged into the battlefield and engaged in a fierce battle, especially the intense fight with the Maai sect's 2 experts, which had worsened his condition to the point where he could no longer bear the burden. In spite of this, Yun Yang's only hope was that nothing would happen to the old marshal and that the fortress of resilience would not fall. Now, the latter had become a reality. Although the former still had a breath left, it was only a breath. It could even be gone at any moment. Both of these hopes were about to become a bubble. How could Yun Yang not be mentally and physically exhausted? He had tried hard just now, wanting to open up a space to connect to Emmy and fight for the old marshal's life. However, the space still seemed to have disappeared completely and Emmy did not respond. In the past, the strange energy that flowed around his body like his arms and fingers could not be used at all. The power of vitality. The power of meteorite. The power of the nation's fate. The endless divine art's power to eradicate evil and promote kindness. As long as any one of these forces could be mobilized, Yun Yang was confident that he could stabilize Qiu Jinhan's injuries. At the very least, he would not die immediately. However, all these forces were sealed in his deific consciousness space. He could not contact or mobilize them at all. Yun Yang's heart sank as if he had fallen into a bottomless abyss. Could it be that he had to face the painful experience of losing a close friend again? Thinking of this, his vision darkened. His emotions were unusually agitated, causing his old and new injuries to flare up at the same time. He could not help but spit out a mouthful of blood and almost fainted. "There's no other way, I can't do anything." Yun Yang's weak voice was like a hammer that hammered into everyone's hearts. Everyone felt their hearts wrench in pain. Shangguan Lingxiu's tears streamed down her cheeks. Even the 9 Supremes Lords were helpless. Was the old marshal hopeless? Fu Baoguo lowered his head abruptly, the muscles on his face spasming as he fell to his knees. His forehead was pressed against the ground as tears streamed down his cheeks soundlessly. As Fu Baoguo fell to his knees, the tent was plunged into a sorrowful atmosphere. Cough, a faint cough sounded abruptly. Everyone turned towards the source of the sound through their teary eyes. Qiu Jianhan, who was lying on the bed, suddenly coughed, his chest rising and falling violently. Then, his eyes that had been shut for a long time opened. However, the old marshal's breathing grew more and more rapid, like a pair of bellows blowing against his chest. At this critical juncture, Qiu Jianhan had miraculously woken up. The old marshal opened his eyes slowly, his gaze still a little dazed as if he was thinking about something. However, when he saw the few faces above him, his gaze shone faintly. His lips moved slightly as if he wanted to say something. Shangguan Lingxiu pressed her ear closer quickly but could only hear Qiu Jinhan's voice as soft as a mosquito's hum, barely audible. It was as if he had used up all his remaining strength to finally say, Yun Yang is here? Shangguan Lingxiu nodded, her eyes teary. He's here, he just arrived, he saved us from the siege." The old marshal's eyes shone brightly as if he was suddenly invigorated. His voice grew slightly louder as well, "Everyone, get out." Yun Yang stays. The old man's pale face miraculously flushed with a few traces of red. In spite of this, everyone present understood that this was the final radiance of a dying man. The old marshal did not have long to live. Chapter 502. Shangguan Lingxiu nodded, choking with sobs. She stood up immediately and said in a low voice, "Old Marshal has asked all of us to leave, only Yun Yang is allowed to stay. All of you, leave, quickly." She knew that time was of the essence. The old marshal might not be able to last much longer. She pushed and shoved everyone out without a word, chasing them far away, isolating the tent from the rest of the crowd beyond 500 feet. The old marshal was at the final stage of his life. The contents of his conversation with Supreme Cloud, whose identity had been kept a secret before his death, must be of great importance. No one should listen, no matter who it was. If it were possible, Shangguan Lingxiu wanted to chase everyone off the mountain to ensure her safety. The 500 feet of space was still filled with the beating of war drums and the faint sounds of killing from the battlefield. The voices inside were so soft that even if the gods wanted to hear it, they would not be able to do so, would they? Shangguan Lingxiu thought so, but the sorrow in her heart only deepened as tears streamed down her cheeks. For a moment, she felt weak and hopeless. Old Marshal Qiu Jianhan was the empire of Yutang's pillar of support. Now, this pillar of support was about to fall. What would happen to Yutang in the future, given the current war? Would its future be bleak? Yun Yang resisted the searing pain in his chest and went over with great effort, saying, "Old Marshal, I'm here, I'm here." Qiu Jianhan's gaze was starting to lose focus, but he stared at Yun Yang's face in a daze, studying it carefully and seriously, trying his best to focus his gaze to see clearly. Finally, a forlorn smile appeared at the corners of his lips as he said in a low voice, "All of them have left, all of them have left," Yun Yang replied. Qiu Jianhan was still worried and said, "You, go, take a look, ask them to go further." Yun Yang's heart skipped a beat as he came to the entrance of the tent in a stride. Looking outside, he saw that everyone was already hundreds of feet away from the tent. They would not be able to hear anything from here. After making sure, Yun Yang returned to the bed. "Old Marshal, they're all very far away, Qiu Jianhan's gaze sharpened abruptly. He was still panting for a moment before he lowered his voice and said softly, "This old man can't make it this time, but before I leave, I still have an unfulfilled wish." Yun Yang said hurriedly, "Old Marshal, please speak." Yun Yang will go through fire and water to fulfill Old Marshal's last wish. Qiu Jianhan mumbled softly, "There's no need. This old man only has one question in his mind. I want to know the answer. If I don't, I will not die in peace." Yun Yang replied, "Please ask away, Old Marshal. I will tell you everything I know." Qiu Jianhan coughed again, barely able to catch his breath. Yun Yang's endless divine art had been circulating in his body, helping him to hold on to his last breath, but he looked even more lethargic than before. Yun Yang's endless divine art had been circulating in his body, helping him to hold his breath, but he looked even more lethargic than before. His eyes shone as he looked into Yun Yang's eyes, panting as he asked, "Yun Yang, are you, was he Supreme Cloud?" This was Yun Yang's biggest secret. Yun Yang had never revealed his secret to anyone. Now, looking into the old marshal's eyes, Yun Yang did not hesitate as he leaned close to the old marshal's ear and whispered, "Old Marshal, you're right. I'm Supreme Cloud, the only one left among the 9 Supremes." Qiu Jianhan's face was flushed, his eyes glowing even brighter. He stared at Yun Yang joyfully, liking him more the more he looked at him. He said in relief, "The 9 Supremes are not extinct after all. This old man can finally rest assured. Heaven still protects Yutang." One of his hands groped about and finally found Yun Yang's hand. With an unknown strength, he gripped it tightly and stared at Yun Yang without blinking. This old man didn't guess wrongly, but this secret, you must keep it forever. Don't let anyone know, don't, yes. Yin Yang's tears streamed down his cheeks, feeling like his heart had shattered into 8 pieces. The pain was so excruciating that he could barely breathe. Once again, he had to face the death of a loving elder. Could it be that this was his fate? Keep this secret. Yutong can survive, if not, I know. I will never let anyone know my identity. Yin Yang promised firmly. Qiu Jinhan's breathing weakened bit by bit, but a satisfied smile still hung on his face. His hand was still gripping Yun Yang's hand tightly, his gaze still filled with love as he stared at Yun Yang and said softly, "Good child, good child." Yun Yang could not hold it in any longer, suddenly bawling his eyes out. At this moment, this mighty Lord Supreme Cloud was crying like a child. "Old Marshal, don't die. I've lost too much. You can't die anymore. I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore." Yin Yang was sobbing, his face devoid of any semblance of dignity. Qiu Jinhan's warm and loving gaze fell on his face as he said softly, "Silly child. How can a person not die?" His gaze grew distant as he murmured, "Speaking of which, this life of mine is actually enough. It's just that, my death, the country's safety, the old wife at home." His gaze was filled with unconcealable longing as he murmured, "Can't give up. Can't give up. But, the motherland is in chaos, how can we cherish this body of ours?" Listening to the old marshal's murmur, Yun Yang, who had lost his soul, burst into tears as he was overwhelmed with grief. Suddenly, the sound of galloping horses came from outside the tent. A voice bellowed anxiously, "Marshal, urgent military news." Fu Baoguo's furious voice rang out from afar, "Stop. What are you shouting for? I'm not dead yet, get down here." Obviously, Fu Baoguo was afraid that the sudden voice would interrupt the old marshal's last words. However, the galloping reminded Yun Yang of something. The mournful cries that had never stopped abruptly. He lifted his head abruptly, mumbling to himself. "Horse, military news? Ready? Ready." The old marshal's consciousness was blurred once more as he answered subconsciously, What? Yin Yang was stunned for a moment before he jumped up in ecstasy. "Old Marshal, you're saved. You're definitely saved. I've thought of a way. How could I be so stupid? The life-saving spiritual medicine is with me but I can't remember it." Tears of ecstasy streamed down his cheeks. However, Qiu Jinhan's consciousness grew increasingly blurry as he murmured, "Your Majesty. Old Qiu has passed away." At this moment, the old marshal had actually fallen into a coma. It was obvious that he had reached his limit. Perhaps his soul would be sent to the underworld at the very next moment. Yin Yang dared not hesitate as he sprung up and stretched out his hand. A gleaming dagger appeared in his grasp as he tore off his robe sleeves and placed his wrist before Qiu Jinhan's mouth. With a slash of the dagger, fresh blood gushed from his wrist. Yin Yang's free hand pried the old marshal's mouth open at once and dripped his blood drop by drop into it. His own blood had miraculous effects, and this was already evident already. However, the old marshal was on the brink of death and might not be able to withstand such a huge amount of medicinal power. He could only rely on dripping his blood bit by bit, gradually, in order to bring him back to life and turn the situation around. The self-healing ability of ace cultivators was extremely strong. Yin Yang had only bled for a moment before his wounds started to clot. Yin Yang waved his dagger again and cut himself, causing the wound to open up again. He repeated this process until he had dripped 3 big bowls of blood before he finally stopped. So much fresh blood should be enough for the old marshal to turn the situation around, right? Yin Yang could not help but let out the breath that he had been holding in. He was shocked to realize that his head was spinning and his organs felt like they were about to explode. Unable to hold on any longer, he stumbled and fell to the ground with a thud. The next moment, he felt endless fatigue and endless darkness surging over him before he lost consciousness. Chapter 503. When Marquis Yun and the rest had waited for too long and finally rushed back to the tent to check on the situation, they were shocked to see that both men in the tent were covered in blood. One was still lying on the bed without a sound, while the other was lying on the ground without a sound. Everyone couldn't help but jump in fright, but then they discovered to their pleasant surprise, Yun Yang isn't dead. Shangguan Lingxiu exclaimed in delight, he's still alive. He's just fainted. It seems like he's exhausted from excessive blood loss. The old marshal was important, but in Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes, the 9 Supremes Lords were still more important, especially when the 9th Supremes Lord was Yun Yang, her something. Therefore, compared to everyone else who was concerned about the old marshal, her first target of observation was Yun Yang. The old marshal isn't dead either. Fu Baoguo's eyes were wide, his heart filled with bliss for a moment. He almost wanted to scream and jump. He's still breathing, it's much stronger now. His pulse is stable as well. This is a great sign, it's unbelievable. Everyone was indescribably ecstatic when they heard the news. Marquis Yun and Bai Yixue were still in slight disbelief as they went over to examine him closely. Although Qiu Jianhan was still unconscious and in poor condition, there was a hint of redness in his cheeks. Even though the wound on his chest was still horrifying and ghastly, his pulse had indeed calmed down, a stark contrast from the terrible condition that had only occurred once a long time ago. Both of them were experts in cultivation and came to the same conclusion in an instant. At least for now, although the old marshal was still unconscious, his life was no longer in danger. Although they did not know what kind of sequela such a serious injury would leave behind, whether he could wake up or not, for now, the old marshal who was supposed to die, had survived. The old marshal's life was saved. One of Yutong's 3 pillars had not collapsed. Thank God. Shangguan Lingxiu was so overjoyed that tears were rolling down her cheeks. Although she was more concerned about Yun Yang, the old marshal was a respected senior to her, an irreplaceable pinnacle of Yutong's military. It was a great blessing that he was saved from certain death. Fu Baoguo grabbed Marquis Yun's hand and shook it as if he had gone mad. He was so grateful that he did not know what to say. Marquis Yun, sir, thank you, for raising such a good son. Qiu Jianhan was gravely injured and his life was hanging by a thread, his condition was deteriorating by the day. During this period of time, no one else had come in, only Yun Yang had been in the room previously. Qiu Jianhan's condition had taken a turn for the better, it must be Yun Yang's doing. There was no dispute about this, and no one would doubt it. Besides, the fact that Yun Yang was so tired showed how much effort he had put in. Fu Baoguo no longer had any doubts about old Marshal Qiu's evaluation of Yun Yang now. This child was indeed extraordinarily capable. The role he could play was even greater than his father's. There was no doubt that the father was stronger than the son. Marquis Yun looked at Yun Yang who had fainted and said softly, Marshal Fu is being too polite. This is Yun Yang's duty. It's my duty to save old Marshal. There's no need to thank me, it's not worth mentioning. Fu Baoguo was flushed, his spirits high as he guffawed. How is it not worth mentioning? Whoever saves the old marshal is my, Fu Baoguo's, savior, second parent. Ha ha ha. Everyone chuckled at his words. After all, if Yun Yang was Fu Baoguo's second parent, then what about Marquis Yun who was standing in front of them now? Young Master Yun looks like his injuries aren't light either. The rescue process must have taken too much effort. Shangguan Lingxiu said rather anxiously, I think it's better to take him to rest first. Even if he's fine, he'll need a few days to recuperate. Marquis Yun smiled gently. If that's the case, I'll have to trouble Lady Shangguan. Everyone smiled meaningfully when they heard him. Shangguan Lingxiu blushed immediately, but she did not shy away. She picked Yun Yang up carefully and ran out as if she was running for her life. Ha ha ha. Fu Baoguo guffawed. Marquis Yun, it looks like good things are about to happen to your family. Since he had already hugged Yun Yang, how could he avoid the skin-to-skin contact? A certain someone's reputation was tied to the lady, of course, he had to get close to her. Marquis Yun smiled calmly and said, this child is really lucky. It is his duty to try his best to save the old marshal, but he has gained this opportunity. What a blessing. Let's hope that this will work out. By the way, should this matter be considered as the old marshal being the matchmaker? Everyone chortled when they heard him, praising Marquis Yun for his eloquence. He had even brought the old marshal's blessings with his words. If the old marshal wasn't doing well, how could he be the matchmaker? He was indeed a perceptive person. When they turned back to look at the unconscious Qiu Jianhan, everyone felt a sense of relief. It was great that old Marshal Qiu was not dead and the danger had been averted. Even though he was still unconscious, everyone felt like they had found their pillar of support. Their hearts were calm and the war was stable. The enemies who kept challenging and invading outside did not seem as scary as before. Shangguan Lingxiu carried Yun Yang back to her tent, her face flushed and embarrassed. Once she entered, she realized that Ji Lingxi and Yu Rulan had followed her in as well. Both girls were looking at Yun Yang with concern. What's wrong with him? It was Ji Lingxi who asked. Ji Lingxi's sallow complexion was still the same as before, as if she did not care much, but the flustered look in her eyes had already betrayed her. It was as if the pair of eyes had grown out of Yun Yang's face, filled with anxiety and inquiry. Shangguan Lingxiu sighed inwardly and said, "He's all right. He's probably just lost too much blood and is a little exhausted. With Yun Yang's cultivation base, he'll be fine after some quiet rest." While she said that, she thought to herself, what a sin. This girl who came out of nowhere is really Yun Yang's fiancée? Otherwise, why would she be so concerned? It was just that she had never heard of this before. Marquis Yun, as a father, did not seem to know about it either. Yu Rulan said, "Lost too much blood?" "Younger sister, feed him some medicine quickly, especially those nourishing spiritual medicine. I think he must have lost quite a lot of blood. No matter how strong his cultivation base is, he won't be able to take it." She was, of course, talking to Ji Lingxi. Despite Yu Rulan's admiration for Shangguan Lingxiu and her closeness, Shangguan Lingxiu was still her sister-in-law's marriage. She could give in to anything, but she could never give in to her sweetheart. If she gave in just once, perhaps her lifetime of happiness would be ruined. She had to do it even if it was not the right time. Ji Lingxi understood her meaning and said, "All right, I'll take it now. I'll take care of Yun Yang throughout the night today. He must recuperate in peace." Shangguan Lingxiu said, "Of course, the medicine for both younger sisters will be fine. Do it quickly." Having said that, she retreated quietly. How could she not know that these two girls must have come from noble families? She was destined to be no match for them in terms of heaven and earth treasures and resources. Since it was not as good as what they offered, she would use theirs. There was nothing more important than Yun Yang's health now. Since they were repulsed by her, she would go out first. There was no need to stir up more trouble. Otherwise, it would only make things difficult for Yun Yang. Standing at the top of the mountain, Shangguan Lingxiu's hair fluttered as her thoughts drifted. "I'm a daughter of a family of generals. My life has long been destined to be spent on the battlefield. Who knows when I'll die on the battlefield? Yun Yang still has a bright future and a bright youth. Why should I be tied down by my love and hold him back? He's one of the 9 supremes, he has a myriad of tricks up his sleeves. He's a presence destined to soar through the 9 heavens. No one can kill him. I like him, but how can I keep up with his footsteps? Let it pass then. That's fine. Let it be." Despite her thoughts and her mood, Shangguan Lingxiu suddenly felt an inexplicable pain in her heart as she stood there. The sudden surge of sorrow was endless and difficult to suppress, as if her heart had been sliced into 7 or 8 pieces. This was the so-called heart-wrenching pain. She stood in the night breeze, tears rolling down her cheeks in a daze. Far away, the noise of battle could be heard from afar. The daughter of a family of generals laughed self-deprecatingly as she cried, "Shangguan Lingxiu, oh Shangguan Lingxiu, even your love, even your abandonment, even your sadness, they all move with the sounds of the battlefield. Your fate has long been decided, why drag others down with you? It's best for you to be alone for the rest of your life. Don't let those who have you in their hearts grieve the fated separation of life and death, never to be able to see each other again. Sister Lan, have we gone too far? Ji Lingxi said to Yu Rulan with a blushing face as she fed Yun Yang medicine. Sister Lingxiu has always been nice to us. I can see that she genuinely likes Yun Yang. Chapter 504. Yu Rulan sighed. How could I not know that I've gone overboard? However, I'm the only one who's gone overboard, not you. Besides, I had no other choice. Shangguan Lingxiu is a good lady, of course. She's kind and good-looking, and her family background is extraordinary. She can be said to be a rare beauty in this world. But, girl, this man isn't anything else. You can't be silly on this point. It's because of her feelings for Yun Yang that I've prompted Sister Yu to do this. Ji Lingxi asked in bewilderment, isn't anything else? What is it? Yu Rulan sighed again. I know that you're a silly girl who doesn't understand the ways of the world. As your elder sister, of course I have to think for you. Even when I know that I shouldn't, I have to do it. It's because Shangguan Lingxiu is kind, good-tempered, and beautiful that she's willing to disregard a girl's modesty for Yun Yang that I've done this. If she wasn't so outstanding and had done so many things, why would I need to worry about you and be the bad guy? Ji Lingxi was still confused. Huh? Yu Rulan felt helpless for her sister-in-law's ignorance of the world and explained weakly, let me ask you. You like Yun Yang, we both know this. However, have you ever thought of marrying him? To be together forever? Ji Lingxi stomped her feet and covered her burning cheeks. Sister Lan. How can you say such shameful things? Yu Rulan said, there's only the two of us now. What's there to hide? Let me ask you, Shangguan Lingxiu likes Yun Yang too. She's a girl, yet she's hugging Yun Yang without a care in the world. If she's not moved by him, how could she do so? She wouldn't do so even if it's in front of two armies. Therefore, deep down, she must be hoping that she and Yun Yang will be together. Here's the question, if the two of you were to compete, would you and Yun Yang be a pair? Or would she be with Yun Yang for a long time? Ji Lingxi paled. It's an undeniable fact that she treats you so well and that she's a good person. But it's also an indisputable fact that she likes the same man as you. Will you give in just because she's a good person? Are you going to give your lifelong happiness to her? Yu Rulan asked in a low voice. Ji Lingxi grew even more perplexed as she mumbled, I really didn't think that far ahead. Yu Rulan smiled bitterly. So, how can I not be the villain? I'm already destined to suffer for the rest of my life. Don't tell me I have to watch you, his only sister, suffer for the rest of your life? Ji Lingxi was at a loss. It was obvious that she had never thought that in such a short time, with just a few simple words, her sister Lan had already fought Shangguan Lingxiu on her behalf more than once. But, is there no other way? Ji Lingxi murmured. Yu Rulan held her forehead with one hand, speechless. This silly girl, can you find another way to do this? Can you find another way? If he fought for it, he might regret it. But if he didn't, he would regret it for the rest of his life. Yun Yang had fallen into a coma due to excessive blood loss and mental and physical exhaustion. Qiu Jianhan, who had been nourished by Yun Yang's blood, was lucky enough to survive, but he was still unconscious. Yutong's two hidden and visible personages were both unconscious, but the war would not stop because of them. Perhaps it should be said that the war of the century between the two empires would not stop because of anyone or anything. In fact, even from the moment Qiu Jianhan was rescued, the war between the two empires had not stopped for even a moment. Fu Baogua had spent all his time arranging his troops to defend against Dongxian when he was not concerned about the old marshal. Fortunately, the old marshal had bought him a few days of time. Fu Baogua had used the terrain he had built these days to almost engage Dongxian. What made Fu Baogua feel the most fortunate was that Han Sanhe had not made a move ever since he had defeated Xiu Jianhan. All the battles now were being commanded by Zhang Gu. Although Zhang Gu could be ranked among the world's famous generals with his incisive tactics and strategic planning, he was not far from Han Sanhe. However, Fu Baogua had always felt that he could cope and persevere with the limited military strength he currently had. If Fu Baogua had to give a reason, it would probably be that as long as he was not facing Han Sanhe, the suffocating feeling of being in the middle of a raging storm did not exist. Yes, when he faced Han Sanhe, he felt like he was being suppressed and unusually passive. Now, however, even though his available military strength was still not much, almost twice of the other parties, he always felt more confident that he would not fall, that he would not lose. The truth was just like Fu Baogua's judgment. Every mistake Zhang Gu made in the war, or rather, it should be called a mistake, it should be, the gap between commands, Fu Baogua could always grasp it accurately. Then, he would counterattack or seize the opportunity to regroup and stabilize the perilous situation on his side. The situation was getting more and more disadvantageous for Yutong because Yutong's military strength was decreasing rapidly in the battle. How could they not pay a considerable price in order to fight an enemy that outnumbered them? However, Fu Baogua could still maintain his composure. The time they had held out had far exceeded their expectations. Every day they could hold out was already a gain. Every day they could hold out, Yutong's chances of winning this war would increase. Fu Baogua did not hold back anymore. He divided his steel cavalry into 3 squads and attacked in turns. The remnants of the Baogua army formed 2 squads as well, supporting the attack with the steel cavalry. Other than that, Fu Baogua had also formed a specialized vanguard team with the ace cultivators in the troop. This group of people was led by Bai Yixue, Fang Mafei, and Marquis Yun. Their role was to attack the enemy's formation in turns. In spite of this, they would only launch their attacks when the enemy's tactics were lacking. Only then could they ensure that each attack could cause massive damage to the enemy while minimizing the number of casualties on their side. Now, Fu Baogua had gradually realized where his side's advantage lay. Perhaps, his military strength, combat power, and number of people were not as good, and his overall situation was far behind the enemy. Furthermore, his defense line was in danger and could be breached at any time. In spite of this, his biggest advantage now was the fact that he had 3 superb experts to watch over him. Bai Yixue, Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Fang Mafei. The martial skills of these 3 people were unparalleled among the millions of soldiers of the 2 countries in this decisive battle. They were also his biggest trump card, his strongest asset. Fu Baogua ran over with a drooling face. Brothers, help me charge a little more. Bai Yixue was the most unfortunate of them all. Whenever something like this happened, he was the one who led the team 7 out of 10 times. Who asked him to have the highest cultivation base? Besides, there were other reasons. Big brother, I've just charged once. Bai Yixue was even less courteous to Fu Baogua now, not even addressing him as marshal but as big brother. To be called big brother by a Heaven Realm ace cultivator, Fu Baogua should feel honored. Old Marshal's situation isn't very stable. Marquis Yun said, I'm a little worried. What if, before Marquis of Heavenly Clouds could finish his words, Bai Yixue had already charged out with a dark expression. The sentence that he did not finish was the magic weapon that rendered Bai Yixue speechless. Xiu Jianhan had been shot by an arrow under his protection. It was a sure fire. Old Fang, it's your turn next, isn't it? Old Bai. Fang Mafei sighed. Young master is still unconscious. I'm worried. What if he's shot by an arrow? Thus, Bai Yixue charged out again with a dark expression. He was cursing inwardly, oh man, can't you King catch me? Just because of such a trivial matter, you're treating me like a laborer and ordering me around. How dare you? To think that I, Bai Yixue, was famous in the martial world back then, let alone the me now. Bai Yixue grumbled bitterly. Sigh. Who was the person I was protecting back then? I'd been through hundreds of battles along the way. When I reached the destination, I was covered in wounds from head to toe and almost died. But guess what happened to the person I was protecting? Marquis Yin asked. I'm not guessing. I'll just lead the team and charge. Bai Yixue charged out again, his face flushed. Oh man, you really can't make mistakes. This was Bai Yixue's reflection on this incident. If his weakness was really caught, he would not be able to turn the tables for a very, very long time. Although the situation had taken a turn for the better, Fu Baogua, as Yutang's marshal, was still uneasy. He was even more confused. According to the current situation, as long as Han Sanhe pushed harder and broke through Tianxian Cliff, he would be able to sweep through the empire of Yutang. There would be no more obstacles. At the same time, it would also mean that the merit of the empire of Dongxuan's expansion would be in their hands. Furthermore, Dongxuan's position as the continent's hegemon would be established from then on, perhaps even stabilized once and for all. However, Han Sanhe had suddenly stopped caring at this critical juncture. He had handed everything over to Zhang Gu. He had gone to the side to drink tea. What did this mean? Fu Baogua thought that this was incomprehensible. If it had been him, why would he not follow up on his victory at this juncture? Even if Han Sanhe wanted to train his troops and groom his successor, there was no need to do so at this juncture, was there? It was important to teach a disciple and train a successor, but was there really a need to train him at this juncture? To put it nicely, it was losing the greater good because of a small gain, but to put it in a more serious manner, it was a hindrance to the military's plans. The crime was unpardonable. Furthermore, it was obvious that they wanted to hand over the great credit of expanding their territory to Zhang Gu. This made Fu Baogua even more confused. Was Han Sanhe an idiot? Chapter 505. Fu Baogua was at a loss. He thought about it again and again, but he could not figure out what Han Sanhe was thinking or what he was plotting. Now that the fortress of resilience had been breached, Yutang's natural barrier had been lost. Although the new defense line that they had built was known as another fortress of resilience, where the people lived, the fortress would cease to exist if the people died. Fu Baogua felt that the pressure he was currently under was not as strong as when he was at the fortress of resilience. It was undeniable that Zhang Gu was a top-notch marshal. Although he was still not as good as Fu Baogua, he had slowly pushed Dongxian to the edge of victory with the initiative that he had accumulated bit by bit. Up until now, both Zhang Gu and Fu Baogua knew very well that the final battle would probably happen within a day or two. The final outcome would definitely be Yutang's defeat. This point was already the general trend, and no one could change it. Fu Baogua had stood his ground until now. Watching his men die one by one, he was already well aware of the situation. Although he was better than Zhang Gu in terms of military strategy, and his thoughts were more experienced and meticulous, he could not make bricks without straw. Tianxian Cliff would be the last battle of his life. If he did not become a deserter, he would definitely fall here. There would be no chance of survival. However, whether it was as Yutang's Eastern Frontline Marshal, the person who had made a pact with Supreme Wind that day, or just a Yutang citizen, Fu Baogua would never allow a second stain to be tainted in his life. I, Fu Baogua, would rather die here than take another step back. This is the fortress of resilience as well. I couldn't fulfill my vow to fall with the fortress of resilience. Let me truly live and die with this fortress of resilience that I've built with my own hands. Teacher, why? Zhang Gu had the same doubt as Fu Baogua. Han Sanhe looked at the dark clouds in the sky with his arms behind his back and said faintly, I thought you would understand. In the end, you still managed to ask. Zhang Gu was taken aback. Teacher? Han Sanhe sighed dejectedly, you will understand, Zhang Gu. I only hope that when the time comes, you won't take the wrong path. Zhang Gu was shocked and blurted out, Teacher, could it be? Han Sanhe waved his hand, ending the topic. He turned to look at Zhang Gu and said, Do you know why I want you to defeat Fu Baogua personally? Zhang Gu said, Teacher, please dispel my doubts. This disciple will respectfully receive your teachings. Han Sanha said slowly, there are many strange things in this world. There were also many strange things happening on the battlefield. But how did a famous general grow up? Based on this old man's lifetime of experience, there is only one path, and that is to step on the corpses of other famous generals to rise. This conclusion is also applicable to the commander-in-chief of an army. Only by defeating a commander-in-chief who is of the same level or higher than him can one rise to fame. If this was all, it would still be within the scope of an ordinary person's understanding. However, there's another strange thing about this duel. When you fight a famous marshal on the battlefield and finally defeat him, you'll unknowingly learn his commanding method. It's like you've suddenly learned a lesson, a feeling of enlightenment that grows inexplicably. You've learned it all at once, and you've improved. You've taken a huge step forward, to an extent that you can't even imagine. Han Sanha said, this is something that outsiders can't understand. Only the person involved will know. From what I understand, it's probably because you fought him 8 to 10 times. It's the same battle before, but as long as there's no winner or loser, no life and death, you won't have this sudden epiphany. Once there's a life and death outcome, you'll definitely have this epiphany. Do you understand now? Defeating and killing Fu Baogua is your chance. Han Sanha said softly but with a hint of melancholy, when you really defeat Fu Baogua, you'll be able to understand half of what I'm thinking now. Zhang Ge was shaken, but he said respectfully, thank you for your guidance, teacher. Han Sanha said slowly, it's too early to thank me. If you can defeat Tai Jing then, you'll understand 70% of me. If you defeat Leng Daoyin, you'll understand 90% of me. Zhang Ge felt like a war drum was ringing in his heart, unable to speak for a moment. Han Sanha said slowly, as for fully understanding me, you'll have to fight me head-on and defeat me. Only then can you understand me completely. What I can't figure out now. I'm afraid you'll be able to figure it out by then. Zhang Ge was sweating profusely. How dare this disciple have such extravagant hopes? Han Sanha smiled faintly and said, where there's a will, there's a way. How will you know if you don't work hard? Now, go and command the battle. If my calculations aren't wrong, the outcome will be decided before dawn the day after tomorrow. This war will end by the second half of tomorrow night at the latest. Fu Baogua walked towards Qiu Jinhan's tent with a grim expression. Qiu Jinhan was still unconscious. However, there was an additional person in front of his bed. It was Yun Yang. Yun Yang was almost fully recovered by now. How is it, Marshal Fu? Yun Yang asked with a smile. This puzzled Fu Baogua. He had never met this young Master Yun before, had he? Why did he feel like he was very familiar with him when he spoke to him now? Not good. Not good at all. Fu Baogua sighed. The situation is really not good now. Fu Baogua said with a grim expression, young Master Yun, I have a favor to ask of you. I hope young Master Yun won't reject it. Yin Yang said in a low voice, please speak, Marshal Fu. As long as it's within my capabilities, I won't hesitate. The defeat of this war is inevitable. Even if there are 1,000 clever plans, there's no turning back. This war can be lost, but Yutong can't be destroyed. The elites of our nation can't be wiped out here. Fu Baogua said word by word, so. I'd like to ask young Master Yun to escort old Marshal away. Only with young Master Yun's personal escort can old Marshal return safely and I can be at ease. Yin Yang asked seriously, what about you? Fu Baogua did not answer. After a pause, he said, Shangguan family of generals young lady Lingxiu is the current benchmark of the family. She's significant and can't be allowed to perish here. Your father, Marquis Yun, Bai Yi, Fang Mafei, and the rest are all elites of the empire. It would be the empire's misfortune if they were sacrificed in vain here. Other than that, the Shangguan family of generals 8,000 family warriors have fought until now. There are still more than 2,700 people left. Young master, please don't feel burdened. The escort troop that I can give you this time won't be more than 5,000 people. Without these people, how can everything be done? I'd like to make it clear here that this mission is by no means easy. In fact, it's exceptionally arduous. Perhaps, it can be said that the Empire's future, whether it can rise again and be reborn, all rests on your shoulders. Fu Baoguo's expression was cold, indescribably determined. Yin Yang asked again, I understand what you've said, but I'd like to ask Marshal Fu to answer me. What about you, Marshal Fu? What about you? Fu Baoguo smiled faintly. I, Fu Baoguo, have promised Lord Supreme Cloud that I'll live and die with the Fortress of Resilience. It's a pity that I've gone back on my word under old Marshal's strict orders. Even if I say that I'll build another Fortress of Resilience, I've still gone back on my word. However, no matter how much I've gone back on my word, I can't run away in a fluster when I've arrived at Tianxian Cliff with the 9 Supremes Lord Spirits watching from above. As a soldier of Yutong, a citizen of Yutong, dying on the battlefield before the country is destroyed is the greatest honor of a soldier. Fu Baoguo said softly, as a soldier, if I'm still alive when the country is destroyed, it'll only be the greatest humiliation of my life. There's no way to wash it away. Yin Yang snorted and said, what are you talking about? Even if the country is destroyed, what about the soldiers who are still fighting unyieldingly, who are still contributing to the recovery of the country? I say, they're all heroic men. How can they bear the humiliation that they can't wash away for the rest of their lives? Fu Baoguo said faintly, of course they're heroes, they're deserving heroes. However, they've never been at the front line before. I, Fu Baoguo, am at the front line now. This is the difference. If I can't die here, it'll be a humiliation that can never be washed away in this world. Yin Yang was silent. He understood what Fu Baoguo meant. The frontline defense troops' duty was to protect the country. If it was breached by the enemy, it would be an unpardonable crime. No matter what reason there was, no irresistible factor, no matter what, this crime could not be erased. Even when the entire nation understood that it was a last resort and could be forgiven, they themselves would never forgive themselves. They would always be brooding over it, unable to let it go. Furthermore, how many people in this world were actually rational enough to put themselves in the shoes of these border warriors? When the situation really came to a head, how many people would dare say that they could forgive them? Regarding my own safety, there's no need for young master to worry about it. I only have this one request. I hope that young master Yun can help me, Fu Baoguo said. Yin Yang asked curiously, there are so many people here and everyone seems to be more powerful than me, more suitable to deal with the current crisis than I am. Marshal Fu, why do you have to look for me? Aren't you thinking too highly of me? Fu Baoguo smiled. Why does old Marshal think so highly of you? Why did old Marshal not look for anyone else but you at the very last moment? He doesn't even allow a third person to be present. These are my reasons. Chapter 506. The only regret of this battle is that I didn't get to see Lord Supreme Cloud and I don't know how he's doing now. Fu Baoguo sighed deeply. I only hope that Lord Supreme Cloud is blessed by the heavens and that he's well. To me, no, to all of Yutong's subjects and people, as long as Lord Supreme Cloud is still here, Yutong still has hope. Fu Baoguo's eyes were looking at the distant sky, his gaze filled with nostalgia and gratitude. Yin Yang said softly, I didn't expect Marshal Fu to trust Lord Supreme Cloud so much. Fu Baoguo's head was still raised, his voice unusually indifferent. When Lord Supreme Cloud turned into Supreme Wind, he enlightened me and gave me a new life. If it weren't for Lord Supreme Cloud, would have lost my reputation and died without a complete corpse. Yin Yang was shocked. He did not expect Fu Baoguo to expose himself in front of someone other than Supreme Cloud. Yin Yang was only Yin Yang, not Supreme Cloud. Naturally, that was how Fu Baoguo felt. That day, it was Lord Supreme Cloud who pulled me out of the abyss. Fu Baoguo said reverently, Lord Supreme Cloud is one of the 2 people I, Fu Baoguo, respect the most in my life. The other one is my teacher, Feng Qingtian. Yin Yang said, Old Grand Commandant Fong is of course highly respected, but Lord Supreme Cloud, he wanted to say that Lord Supreme Cloud did not expect to be repaid for his kindness and did not wish for Fu Baogua to die in the battlefield, but before he could finish his sentence, Fu Baogua turned to glare at him and said loudly, "Ignorant child, although your surname is also Yun and you're also the son of Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, a descendant of the royal family, and you've made great contributions, there are some things that should be said and some things that shouldn't be said in this world. I've blurted out the past in a moment of life and death, but I've heard such rebellious words. It looks like Marquis Yun's upbringing needs to be strengthened." Yin Yang was stunned. Fu Baogua's anger had yet to dissipate. "Young Marquis Yun, considering that we've been comrades, let me give you a piece of advice here. Thinking too highly of yourself isn't a big problem, but it's still a problem. Keep your mouth shut in the future, lest you bring death upon yourself. At least in front of me, don't make any presumptuous comments about Lord Supreme Cloud. You have no right to say anything good or bad about Lord Supreme Cloud." After saying that, he flicked his sleeves and left with a cold expression. He had left Yun Yang alone on the spot. Yin Yang was dumbfounded, speechless. "What did I say? I'm just saying good things. I'm thinking about you. Why can't you tell the difference between good and bad? So what if I'm talking about Supreme Cloud? I'm talking about him. What can he do to me? Supreme Cloud hasn't even said anything, and you're the one who needs to stand up for him? And what the hell was going on? I'm just speaking up for myself, and there are actually people who are defending me. It's so King awkward." This round of scolding was really a torrent of scolding. Night fell. This was actually the calmest night since the start of the war. Both sides knew that tomorrow would be the moment that would decide the outcome of the war. Yutong knew that tomorrow might be the day of their defeat, while Dongxian knew that they would charge past Tianxian Cliff in the battle tomorrow. From then on, the empire of Yutong and the fertile lands in the east would all belong to Dongxian, free to be ravaged. On this night, Dongxuan's troops were resting and building up their strength. Generals of all levels were lecturing and promising that as long as the battle was won tomorrow, how they would be promoted, how they would be crowned nobility for generations to come, how they would be rewarded, how they would. The eyes of the soldiers who listened were glowing with greed. Everyone was subconsciously imagining that after tomorrow's battle, they would be rewarded with unparalleled military merits and riches. If they could make more contributions, it might really be like what the officers had said, they would be crowned nobility for generations to come. Yutong's side, on the other hand, was silent. Everyone was trying their best to rest and adjust themselves so that they could have stronger stamina the next day. At the last moment, they had to kill as many invaders as possible. 1 or 2 would barely break even, 3 or 5 would be a profit, and if they could kill 8 or 10, that would be the final harvest that they would be able to die in peace. Countless people were silent, their heads lowered. However, the unprecedented aura of grief and indignation gradually spread throughout the entire army. They had fought until now, persevered until now, but were they still at the very last moment? Countless sacrifices, facing death countless times, but tomorrow was the end of the world. Was this the end of their lives? A veteran covered in wounds silently wiped the long saber he carried with him and sang in a low voice. "Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield, fighting for the country all one's life, the ambition to fight on the battlefield. When the enemy comes, the bridge we pass. Brother, you grab your saber, I raise my spear, charging and breaking through the enemy lines together, riding and wielding our sabers together, celebrating with wine, the long mountain road together, the long journey to the underworld together. Brothers are comrades in arms are comrades, you don't lower your head, I don't bend my back either, I face life and death, splendor in one hand, I come to my battlefield, you go to your trench, because we're the pride of our hometown elders. You have your old mother, I have my young family, you have your beauty, I have my daughter, when the saber and spear are in hand, when the enemy comes my chest, my blood is burning. When I turn into dust, it's also a soldier's glory, when you burn and turn into a rainbow bridge in the sky, brothers, we still smile proudly. Because we're Yutong's pride. You have the blood in your chest, I have the saber in my hand. You and I, side by side, fight today. If I die in battle, father and mother should smile. What's the point of a man's life if he doesn't defend his country? Father and mother miss me. Look towards the east, look at the place where the flames of war are rising. I'm smiling proudly. Smile proudly for the rest of my life. Smile proudly for life and death. The volume of the song was extremely low. This was a song called Smile Proudly, composed by a soldier after a battle. It had gradually become popular throughout Yutong's military, becoming a popular military song that almost everyone could sing. At this moment, the hoarse voice was singing softly, but it seemed to carry a strange rhythm as it floated slowly in the night breeze. All of the soldiers who heard the song began to sing along with it. Some of the soldiers sang as they took out their letters from home, reading the letters that they had read so many times that they would shatter with just a flip. Even when the letters were already stained with blood and had covered their original contents, the audience read them greedily, word by word, over and over again. When they were done, they kept them carefully and placed them in the most intimate spot. There were tears in their eyes, but there was a smile on the corners of their lips. Some of the soldiers rested their heads on their sabers, watching the twinkling stars in the sky without blinking. Their thoughts were unknown, but they could only sing along softly. Gradually, the singing spread throughout Yutong's military camp, reaching the mountain where the army was. It was like a gentle breeze, lingering to and fro. Fu Baoguo was also humming a song, inspecting his troops from tent to tent. Before the battle that was destined to come tomorrow, he wanted to look at each and every one of his brothers, at least once. He wanted to remember the image of each of his brothers in his heart forever. Even when his soul had departed to the netherworld, he dared not forget them. He could not forget them. Are you afraid of death? I was, but I'm not anymore. What do you mean? Why aren't you afraid now? Because I'm not afraid now. Fu Baoguo recalled the young soldier who was not even 20 years old when he had asked the question and the soldier's reply. He could not help chuckling, tears in his laughter. Although the soldier was only 20 years old, he was already a veteran who had gone through many battles. In the course of his young life, the battles he had gone through were numerous, if not uncountable. Tomorrow, we will die in battle. Fu Baoguo's voice echoed. Brothers, who has any unfulfilled wishes? Speak quickly. If it's possible, I'll do my best to help him complete it. This might be the last chance. If you don't speak now, there won't be another chance. The song was still melodious, but no one answered. Following me, Fu Baoguo, to die, does anyone regret it? There was still no reply. The song continued in a mellow tone. Then I'll nag one more time. If we die in battle tomorrow, our heroic souls will guard here and continue to fight against Dongxian. It will still be me, Fu Baoguo, who will lead all of you to the netherworld and gather our heroic souls to fight against the enemy. It was Fu Baoguo's voice. The military camp that had been silent all this while suddenly roared deafeningly. That's right. If we die in battle tomorrow, our heroic souls will still guard here and continue to fight against Dongxian. Going to the netherworld and gather our heroic souls to fight against the enemy. In the human realm, we won't rest until we die. In the netherworld, we won't rest until we die. No regrets. We don't regret it. The deafening roar was like the roar of a thunder god descending upon the world, ringing deafeningly through the entire mountain, shaking the 9 heavens. In the end, there were only 5 neat words: we don't regret it. We don't regret it. Shangguan Lingxiu, who was watching the scene from the top of the mountain, covered her mouth and choked with sobs. Big drops of tears rolled down her fair cheeks. She felt as if something was stuck in her throat. Fu Baoguo's Adam's apple bobbed up and down, unable to speak for a moment. His breathing was unusually heavy, like a broken bellow. Suddenly, he roared like a lion, "Fight to the end! Fight to the end!" Their ears were filled with the thunderous roar. Fu Baoguo suddenly guffawed. Brothers, all of us here, remember to leave together tomorrow. No one is to be left behind. Your father's military law allows for beheading whether it's the netherworld or the living world. This is military discipline. There was a burst of laughter as the soldiers chortled, "Your father won't be left behind. Not when we're alive, not when we're dead. What's there to be afraid of military discipline for? Let's sing." Continue singing. Fu Baoguo roared, "None of you have seen your father sing, have you? Your father will start today and let you know your father's songs." Then, Fu Baoguo was silent for a moment, as if he was brewing his emotions. All the soldiers stood up at that moment, puffing their chests as they waited quietly for the song that they had never heard before, the song that came from Marshal Fu. A moment later, Fu Baoguo's passionate voice rang out, "Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield, I wrote this song until 4 last night. It took me a long time to revise it." Chapter 507. The 100,000-strong army, whether they were injured, resting, or on duty, echoed almost at the same time. Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield, the song was led by Fu Baoguo. The chorus was loud and majestic. How could a chorus of more than 100,000 people not be loud and majestic? At this very moment, all of Yutong's soldiers could feel their blood boiling. The entire sky and earth were trembling, fighting because of the singing of Yutong's soldiers. The song spread far and wide, reaching the clouds. The vigor of facing death with equanimity, the determination to fight until the very last moment, was as solid as a rock, unshakable, indestructible, and indestructible. It was so loud that even Dongshuan's camp could hear it loud and clear. The fervent pre-battle mobilization also involuntarily came to a halt. Many of Dongshuan's generals walked up to the higher ground in silence, gazing at the pitch-black hill on the other side. The deafening song was coming from the other side of the hill, their gazes filled with uncontrollable respect. Zhang Gu also stared at the other side of the hill in silence, his gaze exceptionally complicated. Only Han Sanhe remained in his tent, not observing Yutong's movements. He stood with his arms behind his back, but the complicated expression on his lean face flickered back and forth. After some time, he finally walked out of the tent with his arms on his back and came to the top of the hill. Zhang Gu was already standing there, looking at Yutong's camp. Seeing Han Sanhe's arrival, he turned to greet him at once. "Teacher, there was hesitation and respect in his voice, but more than that, it was a contradiction that stemmed from his own self-doubt. It looks like you've realized it as well?" Han Sanhe said faintly. The song was still reverberating endlessly. Even the mountains and valleys around Dongshuan's camp were reverberating from the rumbling. Zhang Gu swallowed with difficulty and said, "Yes, I feel that tomorrow's battle will be the most tragic battle I've ever encountered in my life. I actually have doubts about this battle that I've already grasped victory in." A bitter smile hung on Han Sanhe's bony face as he said, "Your feeling is right. The battle tomorrow will be unexpectedly brutal, but the outcome is still predetermined. Dongxian will win, but it will be a Pyrrhic victory. Perhaps it will be a losing battle. I've only encountered such an army once in all the battles I've been through in my life." Han Sanhe uttered word by word, 100,000 troops, 100,000 men of sacrifice. "This is too scary," Zhang Gu said, once. "Back then, when we were fighting Shangguan Lingxiao, we had set up an ambush and bribed our spies. The encirclement was complete, trapping Shangguan Lingxiao in sobbing Ghost Valley, 700 miles away from the Fortress of Resilience. We deployed 150,000 men and surrounded Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men. That battle was just like that." Han Sanhe's tone was filled with nostalgia. "What was the result of that battle?" Zhang Gu asked respectfully. "I was personally in charge of commanding 150,000 men on our side. Against 20,000 men, we had set up an ambush in advance, our bows and arrows in place. It was a perfect time, place, and manpower. All three factors were in place, our odds of victory were set in stone. There was no way we would fail." Han Sanhe sighed, as for the result of that battle, none of Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men survived. All of them were annihilated. When the battlefield was cleaned up after the battle, less than 500 of Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men could be found with their corpses intact, Han Sanhe said seriously. Zhang Ge suddenly felt goosebumps all over his body, a chill running down his spine as he asked anxiously, "What about us?" He was very familiar with his teacher's habits. By saying things like this, he was laying out the foundation for his side's losses. His side's losses would be a number that would greatly exceed his own expectations. Han Sanhe said faintly, "Of the 150,000 men, only 76,300 came back alive." Zhang Ge felt his heart skip a beat, breathing labored for a moment, his eyes almost seeing stars. They had the advantage of a geographical ambush and an insider, but they had still suffered a 1-to-4 casualty ratio. How is this possible? How could we, who had the advantage of time, place, and manpower, have suffered such casualties? Preposterous. Preposterous. Zhang Ge, who thought he had mentally prepared himself, blurted out, disbelief written all over his face. "Why is it impossible? I was there that day, I witnessed it with my own eyes. Thinking about it now, it's still vivid in my mind, engraved in my soul." Han Sanhe said, "Did you know that some of the enemy's soldiers were slashed dozens of times, lying on the ground motionless? They were actually waiting for Dongxuan's soldiers to pass by before they pounced on them, biting their targets' throats with the last bit of their strength. When the corpses were collected, more than 30 soldiers died in vain because of this. Do you know, after that battle, only about 200 of Dongxuan's 76,300 people were lightly injured? The rest of them were basically unscathed. No, I should say that among those who survived, there wasn't a single one who was heavily injured." Zhang Ge was a general who knew his soldiers well, understanding the deeper meaning of Han Sanhe's words at once. His face paled at once. What a cruel battle that had been. Not even a single one was lightly injured. Not a single one was heavily injured. Those who were slightly injured were all dead? That battle was Shangguan Lingxiao's last battle. It was also the last battle of the Shangguan family of generals. It was also the last time this old man and the Shangguan family of generals will fight. Han Sanhe sucked in a deep breath. Since then, this old man's respect for the Shangguan family of generals has exceeded that of anyone else. "I don't even want to meet any heirs of the Shangguan family of generals anymore." He turned to look at Zhang Ge. "Zhang Ge, what you're going to face tomorrow might very well be another Shangguan Lingxiao. Fu Baogua is even stronger and more fearless than Shangguan Lingxiao was back then. Most importantly, the total number of troops under him is 5 times more than Shangguan Lingxiao's. Also, the morale boost before us has greatly surpassed Shangguan Lingxiao's. Against such morale, no matter how many casualties there are, it won't weaken. Unless the other side is completely wiped out, there's no chance of victory." There seemed to be a ball of fire burning in Han Sanhe's eyes. "Lastly, if you win, you'll never forget Fu Baogua for a moment in your entire life. He'll become the most important person in your life. If you lose," Han Sanhe closed his eyes. "Then it'll be eternal damnation. Are you ready?" Zhang Ge felt his heart tremble as a sharp glint shot out from his eyes. "I'm ready." If he, who had 1,000,000 men under his command, were to be defeated by Fu Baogua's 100,000 men, there would be no need for eternal damnation. He could just cut his own throat. What was the point of living? As a general, there has to be a battle that he has to face in his life, a battle that he has to overcome. Only by going through such a battle can he truly ascend to the position of a peerless marshal. Han Sanhe said faintly, "This is your chance, and also your catastrophe." The singing on the other side did not stop. Not only did it not stop, it grew louder and more intense. In spite of this, the sharpness in Zhang Ji's gaze grew sharper. He sucked in a deep breath and said, "Teacher, don't worry. Tomorrow, I will definitely win this battle." Han Sanhe nodded. Then, Zhang Ge asked humbly, "Teacher, what strategy do you think I should adopt tomorrow?" Han Sanha narrowed his eyes and said faintly, I can help you make decisions for all the battles in the past. However, I can't do that for tomorrow's battle. All of my suggestions, regardless of the pros and cons, will hinder you. Han Sanha said slowly, I only have one last thing to tell you. Zhang Gu said sternly, please speak, teacher. This disciple will learn. Chapter 508. Han Sanha had gone back to rest for more than 2 hours. Zhang Gu was still at the top of the mountain, deep in thought. Determination to die. Determination to die. Zhang Ji's gaze grew brighter and more resolute. Fu Baogua asked, has old Marshal's carriage left? It's been 4 hours since it left the base. Good. Has young Master Yun left? I didn't see him. He should have left with old Marshal. Good. That's great. Fu Baogua heaved a long sigh of relief. This Marshal can then be free of worries and fight to the death with all my might. Yin Yang took advantage of the dark night and sprinted like a wisp of smoke towards Tianxian Cliff at full speed. The Temple of the Nine Supremes stood at the highest point of Tianxian Cliff. It was the destination of Yun Yang's trip. I'm sorry, brothers. I have to take this step after all. I can't afford to hesitate, and it's a matter of life and death. Yin Yang stood alone before the Temple of the Nine Supremes in the dark of the night. The long-awaited Temple of the Nine Supremes was right before his eyes. The majestic Yutong, the mighty Nine Supremes. Just the 8 words at the door made Yun Yang stop and stare at them for a long time. It was precisely these 8 words that had created countless massacres and blood debts. After a moment's pause, he slowly stepped into the place he had not visited for a long time. Standing alone in the middle of the hall, Yun Yang was at a loss as he stared at the Nine Supremes' silent statues. At this moment, it was as if he had become one of the 9 statues and no longer belonged to this world. If there's no other choice, I really don't want to use your powers, Yun Yang murmured. This younger brother has really gone to the end of the line. No matter how reluctant I am, no matter how indignant I am, everything that is happening right now is not what my brothers would like to see. If Yutong were to fall just like this young brother would be too ashamed to meet my brothers in the afterlife. So, other than Yun Yang, there was probably no one else in this world who did not know that Tianxian Cliff was hiding a huge secret about the Nine Supremes. During the battle at Tianxian Cliff, the spiritual restraining formation had sealed all of the Nine Supremes' energy within their physical bodies, rendering them unable to use any of it. It was also after that battle that the Nine Supremes had fallen. It could be said to be Yutong's greatest regret in the last 100 years. The Nine Supremes were annihilated. However, it was also because of the spiritual restraining formation that the Nine Supremes' power did not dissipate even in death, being sealed within the boundaries of Tianxian Cliff. Other than the residents of Nine Supremes, the force belonged to heaven and earth. Even though the original owner had died, the force was sealed here and had not weakened at all. Even if a man dies, his strength lives on. That was because the power of these 9 attributes originally belonged to the vast sky and the earth. It was only because of a special method like the spirit controlling array that it was temporarily sealed. However, it was also because of this that this secret had been hidden in this place for a long time. If no one came to draw it, then perhaps after a very long time, this energy would gradually dissipate bit by bit, gradually vanish, and once again transform into the spiritual energy of the world. To be able to draw upon the Nine Supreme spiritual power, one must possess the same cultivation method. Other than that, even if the person's cultivation base was astounding, there was nothing that could be done. In spite of this, perhaps heaven and earth were fated to be mysterious, and mysterious, one of the Nine Supremes had survived. Supreme Cloud. Supreme Cloud, one of the Nine Supremes, had come and personally activated this force. As long as he was willing, he could draw upon it effortlessly. Yin Yang had known about the existence of this force since a long time ago. Since the day he returned to the residence of Nine Supremes for the first time, he had sensed another place where the Nine Supreme spiritual power gathered in this world. As long as Yin Yang arrived there, he could use the massive amount of spiritual power to elevate himself tremendously. However, Yin Yang had never drawn upon the power of this place. He did not even have the thought of doing so. He had been preserving this spiritual power. Even the last time, he would rather destroy his own body to cultivate the power of wind and fire with all his might than use this force. There was no other reason other than this was the last bit of power his brothers had left in this world. It was also an irrefutable proof that his brothers were still alive. If this force were to be used, there might really be nothing left. There would be no more traces of the other 9 Supremes in this world. By then, today, however, Yin Yang felt that he had been forced into a dead end. If he did not use this force, Yutong would definitely lose. The entire country would be under Dongxuan's iron hooves. The people would be plunged into misery, the nation would be annihilated. The land of Yutong was the land that he and his brothers had protected for their entire lives. How could they watch it be destroyed like this? Yin Yang knelt down silently and knocked his head hard on the ground. When he stood up, his forehead was covered in blood. Brothers, Xiao Jiu is useless, please forgive me. It was midnight. When Dong Xian had yet to make a move, Yutong had actually made the first move, taking the initiative to attack. Yutong's warriors were dressed neatly. It was not that the soldiers did not want to clean themselves, but it was because there were rarely any soldiers who did not have blood stains on them throughout the battle. Their armor and clothing were still intact, but even if there were blood stains on them, even if their clothes were tattered, they still tried their best to tidy themselves up. The torn areas were mended as best as they could, their belts were tied tightly and their pants were tied neatly. They looked indescribably neat and tidy. They set off in neat rows, their armors bright and clean. Even their helmets were immaculately polished. Their faces were also the part that was uniformly clean. Everyone's faces were washed and many of the soldiers had even washed their hair. It was as if what they were about to face was not a battle to the death, but an important person. Troops after troops came out from the mountains, the forest, and the campsite, lining up on the plains in front of the mountain. Yutong's soldiers marched and lined up, singing in unison. Looking afar, Yutong's soldiers did not look like a troop that was going to participate in the final battle. Instead, they looked like a ceremonial troop that had come to attend a banquet. The commanders of each troop stood at the front of the formation with their chests puffed up high. All the constructions that Fu Baogua had built during this period of time had long been destroyed, there was nothing left to defend. What was left of Yutong now was only flesh and blood. There was only life left. Then, let us use our lives and blood to build another fortress of resilience that belongs only to Yutong. The trombones sounded passionately. The uniform clopping of hooves could be heard with a rhythm that sent chills down one's spine. Troop after troop of steel cavalry appeared, slowly approaching the left side of the battlefield from the left. Troop after troop of serving troop appeared, approaching the right side of the battlefield from the right. The atmosphere was unusually solemn, the entire battlefield was solemn. My friend has helped me contact Peking Union Medical College Hospital. Line up tomorrow, be hospitalized the day after, and undergo surgery on Monday or Tuesday. Chapter 509. Other than the people, there were also the cavalry's warhorses that came out in formation. For some reason, the warhorses that were usually cheerful seemed to feel the solemn atmosphere today. Even when they were in the midst of such a loud commotion, the warhorses were unusually tame. Amidst the low but passionate singing, all of Yutong's troops, be it infantry or cavalry, went into a conical formation. It was a triangular conical formation. The only purpose of such a formation was to attack. It was a formation that could not defend and only attack. It was a formation that would only be used when facing an enemy that was a few times larger than one's own. At the same time, it was the most extreme and most decisive formation. Among the steel horsemen, 12 youngsters were exceptionally eye-catching. They were also lined up neatly in a row. There was not the slightest bit of hesitation or confusion on their young faces, only determination. These youths were the children from the small valley where Yun Yang had been recuperating the other day. All of them were there, not a single one missing. Shangguan Lingxiu, Qiu Jianhan, and Fu Baogua had solemnly told them to take good care of them and protect them as much as possible. In fact, they were included in the troop that was retreating this time, but when they left, even the Steel Cavalry's leader had asked them to retreat, repeatedly stating that they were Yutong's future hope. It was not cowardice to retreat now, nor was it cowardice. However, no matter how much they tried to persuade them, the 12 youths refused to leave. Since we're men, we should fight for the country. This is a time of crisis for the country. If we valued our lives, we wouldn't have come. We're here to kill the enemy and serve the country, not to be taken care of. If you must chase us away, we'll form our own team and charge the formation ourselves. We won't leave. We've decided to stay here and die here. The 12 youths spoke in unison, their words sonorous and sonorous. Finally, it was Wang Dinghua who made the final decision. They're all good men. Let them stay. Good men and good children. Although there was only a difference of one word, the meaning was as different as heaven and earth. All the men in the military understood the meaning of these words. Towards these few youths, they instantly became more friendly. Previously, they had taken care of and cared for these youths, and even felt a little jealous. A group of half-grown children, what did they know about fighting on the battlefield? Didn't they know that it was a matter of life and death? They had wasted so many good horses, and they even needed someone to take care of them. Leaving was the right thing to do. But now, there was only the camaraderie of fellow soldiers, enough to entrust his back to the greatest trust. Now, with the 12 youths accompanying the team to battle, just from their appearance alone, they were already qualified to be Iron Cavalry. There was not the slightest difference between them and their comrades. They were also prepared to die, ready to fight to the death. They were qualified Yutong soldiers as well, not letting down Yutong's military might. Fu Baogua had changed into a rare set of golden armor and appeared at the center of the army. Perhaps it was heaven's will that the heavens were happy to see Yutong's successful battle, as the snow that had been falling for days finally stopped. Under the sunlight that had not shone for a long time, Fu Baogua's golden helmet and armor shimmered like a deity, his aura unparalleled. War drums. Fu Baogua waved his hand and ordered calmly. Dong. The dull sound of a drum suddenly rang out, spreading far and wide. Then, dong. Dong. Dong, another 3 drum beats rang out. Dong, 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 dong. It was only then that the continuous beating of the war drums rang out continuously. The drum beats were like a dull pounding on one's heart, causing the blood in one's chest to heat up and surge along with the drum beats until it boiled. As the drum beats grew louder and louder, each of Yutong's soldiers' faces seemed to glow. They were still motionless, but their hands that were gripping their weapons tightened gradually, their grip on the weapons becoming steadier. Although all the warhorses were unusually quiet and motionless, each of them had their ears perked up, their muscles tensed up. They did not even make the subconscious movement of wagging their tails. The only movement they made was to keep their eyes forward, waiting for their master's order before they turned into an arrow that had left the bow and headed for the final battlefield. On the opposite side, the shadow cavalry surged forward slowly like a tidal wave. Dongxuan's soldiers' sabers and spears shone brightly, their murderous aura soaring to the sky. Obviously, Zhang had also adopted the most extreme and forceful method to face the enemy head-on. If you want to court death, I shall fulfill your wish. I shall use my strongest combat power, my comprehensive combat power that far surpasses yours, to crush your final counterattack. This is also the greatest respect I can give to my opponent. Perhaps, this was the greatest respect that could ever be given in this world. Dong, 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 drumbeats rang out from Dongxuan's side as well. Almost at the same time, a loud neigh of a warhorse rang out from Dongxuan's formation, followed by the sound of galloping hooves. A majestic white horse galloped out. The person sitting on the horse was clad in golden armor like Fu Baogua, looking majestic. He galloped all the way to the front of the 2 armies and suddenly hollered, Fu Baogua. The person was Dongxuan's temporary marshal, Zhang Gu. He had actually come to the front of the formation personally. On the other side, Fu Baogua sat on the horse's back, his hawk-like gaze fixed on Zhang Gu, but he did not answer. Under the gaze of tens of thousands of people from both sides, Zhang Gu spoke loudly, "Fu Baogua. You and I have been fighting until now. Although we have our own standpoints, fighting to the death for our respective masters, this battlefield is also where the greatest glory lies. You and I know very well that today is the last battle between both sides. You and I both know that today is the last battle between the two sides. Zhang Gu has specially come here to pay his respects to General Fu and to send him off." Then, Zhang Gu waved his hand and hollered, "Wine." Two riders came out from Dongxuan's formation to deliver the wine pouch. Zhang Gu took the wine pouch and took out a wine cup. He personally filled the cup and raised his hand. "Marshal Fu, regardless of who wins or loses this battle, it is still a matter for the future. However, it is the duty of a soldier to fight to the death on the battlefield. Let me give you a toast, and a toast to myself as well. If I die at the end of this battle, I have no complaints. If I die, please, if there's a next life, let's be a bosom friend." As he finished, Zhang Gu tipped his head back and drained the wine in his hand. Zhang Gu finished the 3 goblets in a row and wiped his mouth, speaking loudly again, "I know you're not willing to come out and drink this goblet with me, so I'll drink it myself. These 3 goblets of wine before this life and death battle are delightful, delightful. Ha ha ha." Coming out like this and toasting in such a manner, it showed the true nature of a soldier who was fearless of life and death. It also showed his magnanimity. Whether Zhang Ji's move was sincere or not, it was a beautiful move. There was another result to this, or rather, the biggest goal of Zhang Ji's move was to weaken Yutang's already brimming morale as much as possible, and at the same time, boost Dongxuan's morale with the confidence that they would win this battle. A fleeting glint of glee flashed across Zhang Ji's eyes. Han Sanhe watched from afar and could not help sighing. Both sides were on opposite ends of the spectrum. What was the point of playing these little tricks now that they had come to this juncture? Did you think Fu Baogua would let you off easy? Playing tricks in front of an expert like this would only be a futile effort, one that might even bring about one's own destruction. The reality was exactly as Han Sanhe had predicted. On Yutang's side, Fu Baogua's voice boomed like thunder. "Zhang Gu. This marshal has no interest in the 3 goblets of wine that you've come to offer. I don't agree with what you've said just now at all. I have a few words in my heart that I have to say." Zhang Gu said, "Please speak, Marshal Fu." What he wanted to do and what he wanted to say just now had all been said and done smoothly. Fu Baogua had not interrupted him at all. Now that Fu Baogua wanted to speak, if he were to interrupt him, he would appear to lack the demeanor of a general and shatter the confident atmosphere of victory that he had just built. At the very least, the effect would be greatly reduced. Fu Baogua guffawed. "Zhang Gu, you said just now that we each have our standpoints, we each serve our respective masters and we have no choice but to fight. I don't deny the first half of this, we do indeed serve our respective masters and standpoints. However, the latter part, we have no choice but to fight, I find it hard to agree with it." Chapter 5:10. Fu Baogua's voice was thick and strong, echoing above the battlefield. "Who are you people? What is your purpose in invading Yutang? To put it simply, you are invaders who have come to invade Yutang's great land. We, the soldiers who guard the border, are passively defending. We are the ones who have no choice but to fight. Only we have the right to use the words no choice but to fight. What right do you invaders have to say that you have no choice but to fight? As the saying goes, justice is in the hearts of the people, there is no distinction between right and wrong. What do you say that you have no choice but to fight is nonsense or perhaps a great joke. It's better that you hide quickly and don't make others laugh at you." Fu Baogua's words were sonorous, his voice like a thunderclap as he spoke vehemently. "You said that dying on the battlefield is the duty of a soldier. This, at its core, is understandable, but what do you all die on the battlefield for? For glory and wealth, but we die on the battlefield to protect our homes and defend our country against the invaders. Speaking of which, you are still not worthy of mentioning the word soldier's duty. The so-called greatest glory has nothing to do with you. Zhang Ji's expression changed. You also said that if you die on the battlefield, you have no complaints. If I die on the battlefield, I hope that we can be bosom friends in our next life. Fu Baogua sneered. Let me give you a piece of advice. Keep your words to yourself and stop dreaming. Even if we die on the battlefield, even if there is a next life, we will never be bosom friends with you, the leader of the invaders. Be it life or death, be it this life or the next, you invaders will always be our greatest enemy. If there is a next life, I will only continue to enlist in the army and climb up the ranks to become the marshal again. I will fight you all on the battlefield again, to fight to the death. We, Yutang's soldiers, have never been afraid of battle, but we have never been willing to initiate a war. Fu Baogua said loudly, if you had not come, many of us would not have enlisted in the army. If you had not come, many of us would have preferred to stay at home, to live with our wives and children, to farm and cultivate, to grow old together, to unite with our neighbors, to be filial to the elderly, to teach our children. We were willing to be mediocre for the rest of our lives, willing to die of old age in the forest, unknown but peaceful and happy. But you have come, you invaders have come. We have no choice but to fight. If we don't fight, our homes will be destroyed. Our fathers, mothers, wives, and children will be killed. All of us will be enslaved. That's why we are standing here, fighting against you invaders. Now, in order to raise your morale, you actually say such shameless words. What is the greatest honor of a soldier? Coming from your mouth, it will only tarnish the duty of a soldier. Dongxian is not worthy of mentioning the so-called highest honor of a soldier. At this time and place, only we, the Yutang army, deserve to have it. This is ours. Fu Baogua hollered. Yutang's 100,000-strong army was flushed with agitation, feeling like their hearts were about to explode from the gushing blood. They could not help shouting in unison, ours. The orderly and resolute voices were like thunder in the clear sky, shaking the 9 heavens. Zhang Ji's expression changed, and his pupils contracted rapidly. At this moment, he realized that he had failed. Not only did Yutang's morale, which had just been knocked down, recover after Fu Baogua's words, it was even several times stronger than before. On the other hand, many of his men had their heads lowered, shame that came from the bottom of their hearts on their faces. Zhang Gu could not help groaning inwardly. He had not expected Fu Baogua to not only be a cut above the rest in the art of war and strategy, but also to be so eloquent. His tongue was as sharp as a knife, and his words were sharp enough to draw blood. Zhang Gu was afraid that he had really outsmarted himself this time. Just as he was about to interrupt Fu Baogua, he heard Fu Baogua roar fiercely again, "There's only one sentence in your long speech that's right. You said that I'm not willing to come out and drink these 3 goblets of wine with you. You're right. I'm not willing. This Fu also drinks, but this Fu only drinks with friends, brothers, and fellow comrades. However, I, Fu Baogua, will never drink with an invader. Are you worthy to drink with me?" Fu Baogua guffawed, his voice like thunder. "Who do you think you are? You're only an invader who has come to invade my land, to invade my home, to kill my brothers, to maim my comrades. How dare you dream of drinking with me? Do you think you're worthy?" Pfft! Zhang Gu was trembling with rage when he heard him, hollering, "Fu Baogua." Fu Baogua ignored him and recited, "The hearts of Yutang's warriors, the bones of steel to fight against the nation. Today, when the nation is in danger, we won't hesitate to die." He hollered, "Beat the drums. Sound the bugles. Attack." The majestic war drums rang with Fu Baogua's command. The bleak and desolate bugles seemed to have blown open the gates of hell as a boundless, menacing aura filled the air and engulfed the heaven and earth. Yutang's warriors, whose blood was already boiling to its boiling point, roared in unison, "Kill!" The sound of horse hooves rumbled like rolling thunder. There were 8 squads of cavalrymen, each of them holding a huge flag high as they charged forward like a raging dragon clearing a path. Wang Dingguo was in the center of the formation as he hollered, "The steel cavalry is here. Who dares to invade our land?" Behind him, tens of thousands of steel cavalry responded in unison, "The steel cavalry is here. Who dares to invade our land?" Tens of thousands of people responded in unison, as if a hole had suddenly collapsed in the clear sky. Serving troop. Since we've enlisted, we shall serve our country with loyalty. Blood shall be shed on the battlefield at the border, we shall not let down our youth. Today, we shall serve our country with our lives. Kill. 100,000 soldiers charged forward like a tsunami, determined to fight to the death. Their target was Dongshuan's base. Their aura was unparalleled as they looked down on the world. The military flag fluttered in the wind. Fu Baogua stood at the back of Yutang's army, standing tall like a mountain, his aura imposing. His eyes were glued to the flag that was about to charge into the enemy's base and was gradually blurring, as if he was looking at his next life. He stood tall like a mountain, steady like an abyss, but his vision was already blurry. On the opposite side, the shadow cavalry had already moved out. Like a black wave, they surged from the horizon and rolled forward, blanketing the sky and earth. In an instant, they had already covered half of the battlefield, blocking their path. Extremes against extremes, the two armies had launched into a life-and-death battle the moment they came into contact. From this moment on, the final battle of Yutang's eastern front line had begun. Good brother. Good man. We shall continue to fight together in our next life. I, Fu Baogua, shall still be your marshal. Fu Baogua squeezed his warhorse with both legs and pointed the sword in his hand forward. Just as he was about to urge his horse forward with a roar, his body, which was already charging forward, suddenly jerked and stiffened, inexplicably stopping its charge. At the same time, his eyes revealed a peculiar look of disbelief. Han Sanha, who had been guarding the rear, felt it too. He stood up abruptly, his face ashen and unusually grim. It was at this moment that the whistling wind in the air suddenly changed direction from the northern wind that was in accordance with the weather, turning into a strong western wind. At this moment, the changes in the weather were sudden and without the slightest sign, and it even went against convention. Moreover, it was intense to the point it was unbelievable. The sudden, violent western wind swept the ground, bringing with it a cloud of dust and sand as it hurled towards the east. Yes, it was hurled over. At this very moment, the wind swept the sand and dust over. The violent wind howled, hissing in the air. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into an even more powerful hurricane. Gradually, it was no longer limited to sweeping the sand and dust, but it had also swept up the dust, snow, and ice on the ground. For a moment, the wind was like a hidden weapon descending from the sky, crashing towards Dongshuan's army along with the wind's momentum. At the same time, the wind and clouds gathered in the sky, gathering above the battlefield as if they had heard the order to assemble. In just a moment, the clouds were already densely packed, piling up into a thick layer. Above the thick layers of clouds, flashes of lightning could be seen from time to time. It was obvious that a large amount of lightning was brewing above the clouds. After a few breaths, the rumbling of thunder reverberated in the sky. The next moment, with a thunderous crack, a bolt of lightning fell from the sky. It was unknown if it was a coincidence or if it was the will of the heavens, but it exploded right in the middle of Dongshuan's shadow cavalry. Chapter 5:11. His recovery was almost complete. In the past few days, he would often sit in front of the computer. In the beginning, he would feel sore and tear up after looking at it for more than 10 minutes. Now, he could basically stay in front of the computer for 40 to 50 minutes before his eyes started to feel sore. Of course, he did not just look at the screen these few days. Naturally, he would also open a document and type a few words. He had rested for 3 to 4 days after his surgery. At that time, he really did not dare to look at it. Later on, he started to write a few hundred to 1,000 words intermittently every day, cough. Today, he actually wrote 2,000 words in one go. Then, his eyes could not take it anymore, and he started to tear up. He wrote so few words every day that he could not update normally. But looking at the situation, it would only be 3 to 4 days before he completely recovered. Therefore, he decided to start updating next Monday, the 29th. With the 5,000 to 6,000 words that he had written intermittently over the past few days as a foundation, he should not be too tired in the beginning. Therefore, there was no need for everyone to worry. After not updating for so long, this was the first time in his 10 years of professional life that he felt as if something was missing in his life. He was finally coming back. Thank you for your concern. This time, he was very proud of himself. Although he did not update for nearly 20 days, he basically did not fall behind in his monthly votes. Every time he saw it, he felt a warm feeling in his heart. How could he bear to leave when all of you are so cute? See you on Monday afternoon. Chapter 5:12. If Yutong's Eastern Frontline's charge was said to be the prelude to this extreme war, then this lightning strike was also the prelude to heaven's might. After the first lightning strike, thick bolts of lightning fell from the sky and landed within Dongxuan's formation. How could the power of heaven and earth be resisted by humans? Men screamed and horses neighed. It was a tragic sight. The power of heaven and earth was unstoppable. Dongxuan's misfortune continued as they endured the natural disaster. Not long after the countless bolts of lightning struck, a charred smell began to spread from the ground. Perhaps it was a dozen breaths later, or perhaps it was only the very next moment. With a deafening explosion, streaks of fire dragons appeared out of thin air and rose abruptly, engulfing the entire Dongxian camp in the blink of an eye. In just the blink of an eye, the dozens of miles of Dongxuan's camp had turned into a sea of fire. The lightning and fire appeared at the same time, their power unstoppable. What was worse was that it was reasonable to say that the ground fire had appeared out of nowhere due to the west wind, burning Dongxuan's base. It was understandable and barely acceptable, but why did the lightning strike from the sky seem to have eyes of its own? It only targeted Dongxuan's soldiers and not a single Yutong soldier perished under the boundless lightning? This was a little too far-fetched. Even a novel would not dare to write something like this. Unfortunately, there was still more to come. With another deafening boom, a huge crack appeared on the ground closer to Dongxuan's formation. It was like the gates of hell had suddenly opened. Countless Dongxian soldiers fell into the crack, caught off guard. Water that came out of nowhere poured in. It was obvious that many of the soldiers who had fallen into the crack were no longer spared. What happened next was the few peaks where Dongxian had set up camp. They collapsed without warning. For a moment, the ground was like a pot of boiling water, constantly churning and tumbling. Both men and horses could not stand and fell. It was a true earth dragon turning over, and it was not just one earth dragon, but a few of them at the same time. How could the commotion be insignificant? As far as the eye could see, the ground within a 100-mile radius was rumbling and rumbling. Blood-curdling screams and wails filled the air. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were all screaming in despair. It was the hopeless wail of people on the brink of death. However, the change was not over yet. Streaks of crimson patterns weaved into a huge net in the air and fell with a swoosh. All the Dongxian soldiers who were shrouded in crimson howled in agony without exception. Thin streaks of blood shot out from the pores on their bodies as they died instantly. There were flashes of golden light. The weapons in the hands of countless Dongxian soldiers were sheathed after the flash of golden light. When they landed on their opponents, they would at most injure their tendons and bones. It was difficult to inflict further damage. The difficulty of taking their opponent's life had increased exponentially. All the sabers, swords, spears, and spears had turned into burning sticks made of scrap metal at this moment. These were the signs of Dongxian suffering from natural and earthly disasters, while Yutong was also affected by the phenomenon. Streaks of green light could be seen everywhere in Yutong's army. Yutong's soldiers who were touched by the green light were instantly invigorated, even those who had been severely injured. Most of their injuries were healed and they were brimming with energy, as if they had been resurrected on the spot and were ready to fight again. As far as the eye could see, the sky was covered in layers of clouds that contained lightning and thunder. On the ground, the wind was fueling the fire while the fire bore the might of the wind. It had long turned Dongxuan's orderly troops into a pot of porridge. A pot of mushy porridge. Zhang Gu hollered with all his might, trying his best to recall the army and stabilize their footing. However, the frequent natural and earthly disasters had long surpassed the limits of human control. How could they possibly regroup? By then, Dongxuan's morale had completely collapsed. The wind blew. Fire. Earth dragon. Lightning. Lightning. Water. Blood. Wood. Everything was so familiar. There was only one possibility for such a familiar phenomenon to attack Dongxian but help Yutong. Perhaps it was an explanation. The 9 Supremes. Indeed, the clouds in the sky tumbled violently before 8 huge words appeared. Everyone on the battlefield could see it clearly. It was clear to them, the mighty Yutong, the mighty 9 Supremes. Han Sanhe closed his eyes dejectedly. It was over. The situation that he feared the most had finally happened. Along the way, he had let Zhang Gu be in charge of the main battle. Other than training Zhang Gu so that he, as his successor, could claim all the military merits and obtain the ultimate achievement of defeating Yutong's top young prodigy, there was another concern. Once the 9 Supremes appeared, there would be room to turn things around with him as the backup. However, when the Fortress of Resilience was breached, Supreme Cloud had not appeared. When Qiu Jianhan was on the brink of death and Yutong's elites were trapped, Supreme Cloud had still not appeared. Even when the army had been suppressing Yutong's army, Supreme Cloud had not appeared until now. The outcome was almost certain. Although Han Sanhe's teachings to Zhang Gu were filled with warning and he was even a little pessimistic about the outcome of the battle, Han Sanhe had already come to a conclusion in his heart. Zhang Gu against Fu Baoguo, no matter how brutal the battle was, no matter how many casualties Dongxian had to pay, this battle would still be won. Based on the current situation, it could be confirmed that Supreme Cloud had indeed been killed. At the very least, he was trapped. Otherwise, it was impossible for him not to appear when Yutong was on the brink of annihilation. He was not fated to participate in this battle. Then, everything was simple. No matter how glorious the final outcome of this battle was, only death awaited him when he returned. In that case, it would be better to hand the great merit to Zhang Ji's hands and hasten his rise to fame, grooming the next generation of invincible marshals for Dongxian. Although the consequences for Han Sanhe were unavoidable, Dongxian still had his successor, Zhang Gu, alive and well. His family, children, and descendants would not be too miserable no matter what. The military would always back him up. In spite of this, just as Han Sanhe let down his guard and quietly observed the aftermath of the battle, it was also the most unexpected moment. The power of the 9 Supremes' manifestation powers had appeared once again. Furthermore, this time, it wasn't like the last few times, where there were only 2 or 3 phenomena that appeared. This time, it was like the 9 Supremes' manifestation powers had appeared at the same time to wreak havoc on the battlefield. Almost immediately, all of Dongxuan's troops were dumbfounded. How was this possible? How was this possible? Even if Supreme Cloud was not dead, even if he had come, he should not have been able to create such a terrifying outcome. The manifestations appeared before their eyes, the lightning and fire, the mountains and rivers changing color, the wind and clouds surging, the web of blood, metal, and wind, everything was proof that this was not something that could be done by one person. It was obvious that the 9 Supremes were not dead, not even one of them had died. Moreover, all of them had appeared together. This was how such a situation could be created. Did the 8 words in the sky prove this point, declaring that the 9 Supremes were not dead and had made a comeback at this moment? How was this possible? Dongxuan's soldiers were unwilling to believe that this was true, but everything that they had endured was proof that this was the truth. The 9 Supremes had arrived at the same time and the manifestation of the 9 manifestations, how could there be anyone in this world who could resist them? They were already on the brink of collapse. Even if they were to continue fighting, they would only be sacrificing a few lives for nothing. At this point, it was absolutely impossible to turn the tide of the battle. Defeat was inevitable. Sound the gong, retreat. Han Sanha closed his eyes helplessly and waved his hand. At this moment, all hope was lost. Only those who had personally experienced the power of the 9 Supremes and the 9 manifestations could truly understand its power. Back then, the Empire of Dayuan at the southern border had also had the upper hand in terms of military strength, but it could not withstand the combined might of the manifestation powers. It had crumbled with a single touch. Now, the facts had proven that Dongxian was no exception to the rule. The power of the 9 Supremes was indeed the ultimate weapon of war in this world. It was unparalleled. Unlike Dongxuan's despair, Yutong's military formation was the complete opposite. Yutong's warriors could not help but cheer deafeningly at this familiar scene that they had not seen for a long time, especially the sudden sense of bliss. 9 Supremes Lords. 9 Supremes Lords. Deafening cheers rang throughout the battlefield almost instantly. All of Yutong's warriors were guffawing like they had been injected with adrenaline, charging forward with unstoppable momentum. Kill. The 9 Supremes Lords are here. Yutong is saved. We're saved. This is the last battle, but it's Dongxuan's last battle. Yes, 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 victory belongs to us. Kill these invaders. Many of the veterans were so moved that tears streamed down their cheeks. Just when they had resigned themselves to their fate and were ready to fight to the death, the 9 Supremes Lords had finally appeared. Fu Baogua, who had just snapped back to reality and was charging forward, was almost frozen from the ecstasy on his face. Only hot tears were streaming down his cheeks. After some time, he suddenly guffawed, tears still rolling down his cheeks as he roared in a hoarse voice, "Mighty Yutong! Mighty 9 Supremes! Mighty Yutong, mighty 9 Supremes!" Countless people were shouting the slogan with all their might, almost coughing blood from their throats. It was as if they could not vent the extreme happiness and excitement in their hearts if they did not shout like that. Yutong's morale was unstoppable, like a ferocious tiger descending the mountain. Dongxuan's military was dispirited, their morale plunging to freezing point. There was no longer any will to fight. Even the Shadow Cavalry, who was known for their military discipline and was known as the most elite, was in a state of disarray, unable to retaliate. Facing the 9 Supremes at the same time, who would dare say they could resist? That was the true power of heaven and earth. It was not something that a human could fight against. Chapter 5:13. Fortunately, Han Sanha's signal rang out haphazardly. After a while, it finally became a unified command, bringing some direction to the disorderly morale of the army. Dongxuan's troops turned around and ran back with all their might, retreating like a receding tide. At this point, they could only think of running, to leave the range of the heaven and earth's might as soon as possible. In spite of this, Yutong's morale was high. Chase. Kill. Their only thought was to charge and kill as they gave chase. Zhang Gu still did not want to retreat. The glory of 1,000 years was within his grasp, within his reach. He was about to secure the absolute position of the continent's hegemon. Yet, such a fatal turn of events had happened at this crucial moment. Zhang Ji's head was buzzing. Don't retreat. We have the advantage in numbers. Hold on, hold on. Zhang Ji's eyes were bloodshot. He drew his sword and killed a few of the defeated soldiers personally, trying to control the situation. However, with his strength alone, how could he stop the tens of thousands of soldiers who had already collapsed? Even if he were to kill without stopping, how many people could he kill? The truth was cruel. Not only could Zhang Gu not stop the fleeing soldiers, he was instead surrounded by them, retreating involuntarily. When he came to his senses, he had already retreated all the way out of the fortress of resilience. Where's teacher? Where's teacher? Zhang Gu shouted in a frenzy, looking flustered. In such a critical moment, the only person he could think of was his omnipotent teacher, the god of war, Han Sanha. It was a pity. The defeated army was like a landslide. Even if Han Sanha were to step forward personally, he could not change the situation. No matter how elite the troop was, once the morale of the army collapsed and they retreated like this, even if a real deity descended from heaven, he would be helpless, let alone the continent's god of war. Under such circumstances, Han Sanha could gather the defeated soldiers and run in one direction. It was already a feat worthy of a peerless marshal. Yutong's warriors were like ferocious tigers that had just been let out of their cage, chasing after the enemy bravely without letting up. They had been holding back for such a long time. Now was the time for revenge. If he didn't do his best to kill the enemy and take revenge now, when would he? Even a soldier with a broken leg would struggle to find a horse to ride and use all his strength to chase after the enemy. Avenge our fallen brothers. Li Erniu, did you see that? The 9 Supremes Lords are here, we've won, we've avenged you. Boss Chi, the spirits in the netherworld must be overjoyed. Revenge. Kill them all. Kill all these invaders. Yutong will not allow enemies to wreak havoc. Those who invade Yutong shall be killed, no matter how strong they are. Fu Baogua commanded the troops to give the order to pursue and kill them. Chase after them. Chase them until they're all dead. Honestly, Fu Baogua did not want to pursue her so thoroughly. Fu Baogua understood this better than anyone else. This was a great taboo for commanders and generals, and a great taboo for strategists. Although Dongxian was defeated now, with Han Sanha and Zhang Jiyi's abilities, it would not take long for them to rebuild their army, perhaps with just a place to settle down. Although the army was temporarily routed, it did not mean that it would be routed forever. If they were to be bitten back, it would cause a change in the favorable situation. In spite of this, Fu Baogua had to give chase now. He had already realized that something was not right with the situation. The 9 Supremes' power had only been unleashed once just now. The unstoppable force was unparalleled, but it seemed like each of them had only attacked once. After that, there had been no more movements, as if the 9 Supremes had stopped. This was not a situation that should have happened. Although the advantage of both sides had been reversed, Dongxuan's losses were still limited and their foundation was still intact. As long as they cleaned up the defeated soldiers and regrouped, the situation would change once again. Therefore, the 9 Supremes should continue to unleash their manifestation powers to assist Yutong and secure their victory. Therefore, Fu Baogua immediately realized that the 9 Supremes' power would only have this one chance to attack. Could it be that something really happened? The 9 Supremes had not made a move previously because of some reason. Now that they were in a precarious situation, they were finally forced to make a move, but even if they did, it would be as far as they could go. If that was the case, then they could only continue chasing and fighting. They had to maximize the results of this battle as much as they could. They had to extend the time that Han Sanha had the chance to catch his breath. If his guess was right, Yutong's disaster would still come once Han Sanha had the time to catch his breath. The danger might even be greater than before. Yutong's troops' morale was at its peak now. It was time to push on. If they were to slow down, they would fall into a stage of exhaustion. If Dongxian were to retaliate, Yutong would suffer a great defeat immediately and their combat power would be diminished due to the interference of various negative emotions. The final outcome would not even be as good as when the soldiers fought to their deaths. After all, it was difficult to have the thought of fighting for their lives now that there was hope. How could a person's emotions change drastically again and again? Especially now that the fortress of resilience was gone. With this natural defense line gone, it would take at least a year to rebuild it. At this moment, a deafening neigh could be heard as a red silhouette sprang up from Yutong's troop like a bolt of lightning. There was a 99% chance that he would follow in Zhang Jiyi's footsteps and be scattered by the routed army. That would have been a massive defeat and there would be no turning back. Therefore, he took the first step and waited at the place where the army had retreated 100 miles, raising his military flag. Given the current situation, the routed army had to be given a buffer. It was only at such a time when the stamina of the routed army that had been running for their lives was almost depleted. Most importantly, the fear of the unknown force was almost numb to them, and they needed someone to rely on, a pillar of support. Only then could Han Sanha's sudden appearance achieve such a stunning effect. This logic sounded simple, but under such circumstances, there were at most 3 people in the entire continent who were able to stand out and forcefully stop the defeated army from falling to the ground. In the entire continent, there were at most 3 people who could do this. In order to achieve this, the commander-in-chief must have the ability to remain calm in the face of danger and have unparalleled prestige in the army. Neither of these 2 qualities could be lacking. It was truly a feat that could not be accomplished by ordinary people. Dongxuan's routed army surged like the tide. Looking from afar, Han Sanha's side was like a pillar of support amidst the raging waves, a pillar of stability. The routed army was like a raging tide, but when it passed by Han Sanha, the pillar of stability, it quickly turned from a torrent to a slow stream before it stopped and regained its momentum. It was nothing short of a miracle. This was what it meant to be able to turn the tide. Zhang Gu retreated with the routed army, almost coughing blood along the way. When they finally came close and slowed down, Zhang Gu still wanted to draw his sword to slash and suppress the routed army, but he realized that the speed at which the soldiers around him were fleeing had slowed to a crawl. Perhaps it should be said that they were no longer fleeing, but advancing slowly. Zhang Gu sucked in a deep breath and looked over. Once he saw the solemn military formation, tears fell from Zhang Ji's eyes. He choked, "Teacher." Han Sanha remained silent and unmoving, his gaze calm as he waved his hand lightly. Zhang Gu felt his body brimming with energy as he strode over. In just a few steps, he had regained his composure. When he came to stand beside Han Sanha, he was completely composed, even the dejection of his defeat had vanished without a trace. Even if the sky were to fall, everything would be fine as long as his teacher was here. The continent's god of war was the only one who respected his teacher. With his teacher here, so what if the 9 supremes were to come together? Dust billowed from afar. Han Sanha narrowed his eyes, looking at where the smoke was rising into the sky, and said faintly, "That's where the only chance to turn the tide of this battle lies. Zhang Gu, remember this. This is the last chance that I can teach you and allow you to learn from me." Zhang Ji's face was filled with sorrow. "Yes. Watch closely." There was no expression on Han Sanha's face, only endless indifference. His gaze was distant as he looked into the distance. Fleeing is the most humiliating thing in a general's life, but it's something that can't be avoided. Once it happens, it's the worst-case scenario in a general's life. However, nothing is absolute in this world. Even when the crisis is right before your eyes and you're in a hopeless situation, there's still a chance to turn things around. As long as you don't panic and still have the prestige of stabilizing the army's morale, you can seize the opportunity to turn the tide of the battle. Even if it doesn't work out, you can still retreat in one piece and not suffer a crushing defeat. The current state of the battle has been reversed. The enemy has gained the upper hand, but it's not yet a victory. If the enemy's general is greedy for victory and doesn't know that he's going to lose, he's going to pursue us with all his might, causing his attack formation to fall into disarray. Then, we might still have a chance to turn the tide of the battle. Han Sanha said faintly, "Let's see if Fu Baogua can still maintain his composure at such a time. If he can, his position as Tianquan's god of war will be secured and we can retreat in one piece. On the other hand, if he can't, we'll charge back tonight. There's a huge disparity in our military strength. Even though our army has just been defeated, our combined combat power is still above Yutong's eastern troop." Zhang Gu answered humbly and seriously, "Yes. What I said isn't only for Fu Baogua. It's the same for anyone you're facing, any general. As a general, remaining calm in the face of danger is the demeanor of a great general. Not wavering even in death." Han Sanha's voice seemed to come from a faraway place as he said, "You must remember these words of mine. You can't forget them no matter what, you can't lose your composure. That's why I said that you've disappointed me this time." Han Sanha said solemnly, "When the army was defeated, you, as the marshal, didn't flee first, but you didn't manage to stabilize the army's morale. You couldn't avoid being held hostage by the defeated army. After today's defeat, of course, you should follow the troops, but what you should do is to send your own bodyguards ahead of time with your marshal's flag. Go ahead and raise your marshal's flag on the road that we must pass 60 or even 80 li away. You didn't react as a marshal. Along the way, I've only seen your indignation, your rage, your despair, your violence, and your murder. I didn't see your composure, your unruffled mind despite the defeat. Based on this alone, you're already far from Fu Baogua's level." Han Sanha's gaze was distant. "If you can't overcome the fear in your heart, you'll never be able to be a qualified marshal. I hope that the disappointment I feel today ends today. There won't be a next time, never. Yes. This disciple will remember. I won't let you down again." Zhang Gu lowered his head in shame. There were still countless defeated soldiers from Dongxuan's side fleeing for their lives. At the same time, there was also the thunderous clatter of hooves coming from where the thick smoke was rising. Yutang's cavalry had caught up. Han Sanha listened and chuckled bitterly. The situation that I'm most unhappy about has happened. Fu Baogua isn't greedy for victory, nor is he panicking. The clatter of the hooves is still grand and orderly. Han Sanha shook his head. Turning defeat into victory is only a wild wish now. Zhang Gu looked disappointed. With my understanding of Fu Baogua, it's only reasonable and expected for such a situation to occur. It's all right, though. Now, let me teach you another lesson. Han Sanha said faintly, "This lesson is called, the merciful should never command an army." Chapter 5:15. Before his words echoed in the air, Han Sanha's expression turned cold and ruthless as he raised his right hand lightly. What followed was a series of commands that rang out resolutely behind him. In front of them, the countless fleeing Dongxian soldiers saw that they had regained their footing and were regrouping. It was as if hope had dawned upon them and they were about to return to their troops. However, they were shocked to see tens of thousands of longbows drawn, the arrowheads glinting coldly as they pointed at the sky in front of them. There were many Dongxian soldiers who saw this, but they did not know the purpose of this action and who it was aimed at. Yutang's pursuing troops were still a distance away, they were not even within the range of the arrows. Was this not an aimless shot? "Teacher." Zhang Ji's heart skipped a beat when he saw the situation. Han Sanha ignored Zhang Ji's call and ordered faintly, "Release the arrows." Swoosh, 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 countless sharp arrows covered the entire sky in an instant. The arrows that blanketed the sky were not aimless. The fleeing Dongxian soldiers who were still surging forward suffered the sudden rain of arrows almost unprepared, collapsing with cries of agony. With just a single wave of arrows, no less than 10,000 routed soldiers were killed on the spot. They were the last part of Dongxuan's fleeing troops, the link between Dongxian and Yutang's pursuing troops. Han Sanha had cut off this link for the sake of the follow-up battle, like a warrior who had cut off his wrist, ruthlessly. The rain of arrows stopped as the thick stench of blood permeated the air. The stench of blood had always been a common occurrence on the battlefield, but the source of such a huge commotion and casualties was their own people. It was inevitable that it was different from the past. The entire Dongxian troop suddenly fell into an unprecedented silence. It was the duty of a soldier to obey orders. It was not that the tens of thousands of archers did not know what they were doing, but since the order was given by their superior, they had to execute it. Although they already had a rough idea of what to do, the reality was still shocking and chilling to the core. Since the tens of thousands of archers were acting this way, the other Dongxian soldiers were even more fearful and doubtful. "I know what you want to say," Han Sanha said expressionlessly. "It's not too late to wait for them to rejoin the troop. In fact, as long as we mobilize the shadow knights that have already been gathered to support them, they will be able to return safely, right? Zhang stared straight ahead at the black mass of corpses of his comrades. The corpses were like porcupines. He felt as if his heart was being cut by a knife. For a moment, he actually forgot to reply. But you've forgotten that time waits for no man. Let's not talk about how they're going to deal with Yutang's pursuing troops if they rush over and have no time to get into formation. Han Sanha said coldly. Furthermore, their so-called return will only cause another wave of chaos to the troops that have already formed their combat capabilities. You have to know that at this point in time, even the slightest disturbance will cause a huge impact. We won't have the room to reorganize the troops anymore. At that time, as long as the enemy charges and establishes an advantage, they will be able to trigger the panic from before. At that time, it would truly be a crushing defeat, and they would die a graveless death. Han Sanha uttered faintly, battle song. Although Han Sanha's voice was nonchalant, his tone was cold and harsh. Zhang Ge shuddered when he heard him, lifting his head in terror. Teacher. Listen carefully, watch carefully. This is the last time I'm teaching you. Han Sanha said rather ominously, what comes next is another lesson. This time, it's called, cultivation of aura. Before his words echoed in the air, he waved his hand. Suddenly, a loud roar erupted from the Janissaries. Roar. Then, thousands of people roared at the same time. The sound was earth-shattering and deafening. Fight! 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 All the soldiers and steeds, all the soldiers were energized at once. Then, a voice hollered, chill with a sword. Mountains and rivers. The voice was unexpectedly majestic and impassioned. 3,000 Janissaries puffed out their chests at the same time, shouting with all their might, chill with a sword, mountains and rivers. Another person's voice rang out, chill with a sword, mountains and rivers. This time, there were more echoes. Chill with a sword, mountains and rivers. It was no longer a call for 100 or 1,000 responses, but tens of thousands of people. Then, another voice led the way, chill with a sword, mountains and rivers. All the 200,000 Dongxian soldiers who were already in formation chanted in unison, chill with a sword, mountains and rivers. In the end, everyone, be it the injured, the Janissaries or the routed soldiers, roared at the same time, their voices growing more and more uniform. More and more forceful. More and more direct. The flag was waved. The cheering stopped abruptly. However, Zhang Ge could clearly feel the soaring fighting spirit, the invincible aura, coalescing into form amidst these few chants. They were routed soldiers who had just been gathered, but they had formed an aura that was sharper than a dagger in a matter of moments. Zhang Ge even felt a surge of confidence that even if Fu Baoguo were to arrive with his army, he would be able to fight them with such a troop in his hands. There was only awe in Zhang Ji's heart at this moment. Han Sanha's method of reorganizing the army seemed ordinary, at most, but to be able to achieve such a feat at a time like this, when they were on the losing end, was truly a miracle. It was unbelievable. On the opposite side, Yutang's cavalry appeared amidst the smoke and dust as expected, their ferocious aura not diminishing at all. Han Sanha squinted and said, the aura has been formed, but it's a pity that the combat power is still incomplete. This is the third lesson I'll teach you, and the last lesson I'll teach you in this life. This lesson is called sacrifice. Zhang Ji's heart skipped a beat as he lifted his head to look at Han Sanha and cried out involuntarily, Teacher, you. Han Sanha stared at the opposite side with narrowed eyes. A rush of galloping could be heard as a crimson cloud burst out from Yutang's cavalry formation. It took only a few breaths, but it had already traversed thousands of feet and arrived before Dongxuan's troop alone. As the crimson cloud arrived, a voice filled with murderous intent rang out, Han Sanha, since you're already here, do you still think you can leave? A tall and majestic crimson steed entered Dongxuan's sight. The red steed was taller than ordinary horses by at least 1.5 heads, and its body was almost 2.5 meters tall. Its entire body was covered in red fur, and it stood there like a burning flame, raging endlessly. The pair of horse eyes were filled with intelligence. When their gazes met, Dongshuan's people actually felt a faint sense of disdain. Disdain? This was merely a horse, but it actually gave off the feeling that it did not even consider the 200,000 soldiers in front of it worthy of its attention. It stood there, its red mane floating in the air like flames. It looked at the group as if saying, "All of you are trash." On the horse's back, a person stood tall and straight, equally arrogant and disdainful. That handsome and exquisite face made everyone feel ashamed of their own inferiority. His figure was tall and slender, like a jade tree in the wind. His purple robe fluttered slightly in the wind, but his gaze was like a bolt of lightning, filled with boundless iciness. As he scanned the Dongxian troop in front of him, his gaze focused on Han Sanhe. The long saber in the man's hand was still gleaming with a crimson glow. It was a ghastly sight, but there was a hint of a cruel smile on his face. Ha ha ha. Han Sanhe's chuckle rang out calmly. His eyes were filled with admiration as he looked at Yun Yang and said with a smile, "So it's young Master Yun who has graced us with your presence. It looks like this old and useless one hasn't guessed wrongly. Young Master Yun is no ordinary person indeed." Yun Yang smiled faintly and said, "I'm very pleased to be looked upon so highly by Marshal Han." This time, Han Sanhe's composure struck Yun Yang as something special and unexpected. Han Sanhe could feel Yun Yang's deific sense lingering on him. He could not shake it off no matter what he said under such circumstances. He could not help feeling apprehensive. Other than being the publicly acknowledged god of war, Han Sanhe also had considerable cultivation base attainment that was no weaker than old Marshal Qiu or Leng Daoyin. He was already at the pinnacle realm's advanced level. Based on his talent alone, Dongxian might lose a god of war, but it might gain a heaven realm cultivator if he were to devote himself to cultivation. In spite of this, Han Sanhe had already circulated his deific consciousness to its maximum, but he still could not break free from Yun Yang's harassment. The only reason was that Yun Yang's cultivation base was far above Han Sanhe's and had reached a height that exceeded Han Sanhe's knowledge. Han Sanhe was not the only one who was shocked, the experts beside him were equally shocked. Chapter 5:16. Han Sanhe was speechless. His warhorse was kneeling with its front hooves on the ground, its head lowered like it had committed a crime, like a condemned prisoner. Although Han Sanhe was still riding on the horse, his feet were already touching the ground. No matter how calm Han Sanhe was in the face of death, he could not help but feel utterly speechless. After a pause, Han Sanhe dismounted his warhorse and stood with his arms behind his back. He smiled faintly and said, "Looks like this old man has been blind, and I have been disrespectful. Young Master Yun's horse is actually the legendary king of horses, one that only appears once every 10,000 years. The legend of the king appearing and all horses bowing down to him is true. Young Master Yun is truly blessed. King of horses, this marshal apologizes sincerely for my lack of manners." Yun Yang said sincerely, "Marshal Han, how gracious you are." Han Sanhe said faintly, "This is probably the only grace a defeated general has left." He laughed and said in a carefree manner, "As a militant, the greatest fortune is to be born in troubled times and to be able to build one's career. However, in this heavenly world of soldiers, a powerful weapon that shouldn't exist has appeared. It's a gift from the heavens that destroys the balance of everything." Yin Yang nodded in agreement and said, "That's right. Yutong's 9 Supremes, such an existence shouldn't have appeared in this world, nor should it have appeared on the battlefield. The existence of the 9 Supremes is the nightmare of all militants and marshals, it's also the source of their sorrow." Han Sanhe sucked in a long breath. No matter how many schemes there are, they can't stand up to the power of nature. In the face of such boundless might, the so-called talent of a commander is nothing but a joke. Han Sanhe said faintly, "Actually, the 9 Supremes are not only the sorrow of this old man and the marshals of the 4 empires, They are also the sorrow of Yutong's marshals like Tai Zheng and Fu Baogua. Young Master Yun, do you agree with this? Yin Yang nodded. I agree with this argument as well. However, the root of this matter concerns our respective standpoints, so I'm very happy to see such an existence that shouldn't exist in Yutong. The stronger it is, the better. Shouldn't the enemy's nightmare be our Yutong's favorite sight? Han Sanha guffawed. Well said. If the 9 Supremes were in Dongxian, this old man would think the same. Of course, I wouldn't mind. While both of them were talking, Yutong's troop had arrived as well. They were slightly further away from Han Sanha. The army was majestic, their flags fluttering in the wind. Naturally, Fu Baogua came along as well. Along the way, Fu Baogua dared not be idle at all. He was afraid that Yutong's army would be greedy for victory and their formation would fall into disarray, giving the enemy a chance to counterattack. Otherwise, they would not have arrived at this time. However, Fu Baogua could not help but feel suspicious when he saw the confrontation between the two armies. His military experience told him that there might be a great turning point right before his eyes. Although Yutong's army had the upper hand now, it was not a victory. After all, Dongxuan's military strength was still present and its combined combat power was still far superior to Yutong's eastern troop. Any sudden change could change the tides of the war. He watched as Yun Yang and Han Sanha conversed from afar. Seeing that both of them seemed to be chatting happily, occasionally guffawing, he could not help touching his face and murmuring, I didn't expect Marquis Yun's young master to have such a relationship with Han Sanha. He's an expert indeed, his actions are unpredictable. Seeing that both of them seemed to be done with their conversation, Fu Baogua galloped out, joining the conversation of the century. Yin Yang did not turn back, his eyes still trained on Han Sanha as he said with a faint smile, our true protagonist, Fu Baogua, is here. An inexplicable cloud flashed across Han Sanha's eyes, as if all the glory he had in the past had flashed past his eyes at this very moment. Then, he straightened his back and continued to place his arms behind his back, looking up at Fu Baogua who was riding over. Marshal Han, it's been a long time. We meet again. Fu Baogua hopped off his steed and strode over when he was near. Although the two armies were at each other's throats and there was no room for negotiation, everyone in the military would still respect Han Sanha, the legendary god of war of his generation. Even when they hated him to the core, they still respected him like a deity. Han Sanha watched Fu Baogua with his arms behind his back. After a long time, admiration shone in his eyes. Fu Baogua has indeed become a pillar of support. Yutong's fortune. I dare not. Marshal Han praises me too much. Fu Baogua said, the current battle was truly a fluke. Han Sanha shook his head and said, how can there be flukes in a war? You, Fu Baogua, are indeed qualified to compete on the battlefield with any famous general in this world. This is an indisputable fact, a reality. Fu Baogua smiled and said seriously, luck has always been a part of one's ability, but this luck of mine is really just luck. If Marshal Han had commanded the previous battle personally, Yutong's eastern troop could only win even with the help of the 9 Supremes Lords. It would have been impossible for them to achieve such a result. This is also the truth. Han Sanha smiled faintly and sighed discreetly. At this point, there was no need for modesty anymore. Han Sanha knew that Fu Baogua was speaking the truth and was speaking from the bottom of his heart. He wanted Zhang Ge to make a name for himself in a single battle, so he had to take the risk. Now that the risk had appeared, the current reality was the reward for failing to take the risk. I wonder if Marshal Han has anything to say to Baogua by coming personally and waiting here, asked Fu Baogua. Since he saw Han Sanha standing here, he had guessed Han Sanha's intention almost immediately. However, it was because he knew that his respect and admiration for Han Sanha had involuntarily increased. This was an extremely terrifying enemy, but he was also an opponent worthy of anyone's respect. Han Sanha smiled and said, this old and useless one is waiting here, of course, to talk to Marshal Fu. As the saying goes, it's difficult to have a bosom friend, but it's difficult to have an enemy. Please enlighten me, Marshal Han, Fu Baogua said respectfully, completely ignoring the sarcasm in Han Sanha's words. Han Sanha turned to look at his Dongxian troop. Of course, he would not miss the concerned gazes directed at him. He could not help feeling a pang in his heart as he turned back and said, I believe Marshal Fu can already tell that after today's battle, Dongxuan's morale has been greatly damaged, but Yutang has lost its natural barrier as well. The unbreakable reputation of the eastern border no longer exists. If we continue to fight, it'll be a devastating scene. I believe that neither of us will be happy to see this. Fu Baogua said calmly, yes, Marshal Han is right. However, Yutang's warriors have long disregarded life and death. Our only thought is to protect our home and country. At most, we'll perish together, that's all. Although Fu Baogua's tone was calm, everyone could hear the determination in his words that he would not hesitate to fight. Han Sanha's tone was still calm and steady. Our army has been defeated in today's battle, this is a fact. However, I've already regrouped my troops and formed a combat force. If we continue to fight, I'm still confident that both sides will perish together. This is the outcome that Marshal Fu has in mind. However, is Marshal Fu really happy to see this? Now that Dongxian had been defeated, it was a huge loss. There were less than 300,000 soldiers left and their morale and confidence had dropped to the freezing point. The only reason they could still assemble into an army was because of Han Sanha's prestige. Yutang was not having an easy time either. The number of people they had left was far less than Dongxuan's and they had expended a great deal of their energy. Morale was important, but they still needed sufficient physical strength and the support of a comprehensive military force. If the battle were to continue and Dongxian was reduced to a wailing army, the outcome would be hard to predict. Even the best outcome for Yutang would be for both sides to perish together. Reality was cruel. It was impossible for Han Sanha to win and regain the overwhelming advantage he once had, but he knew that it was impossible. However, it was entirely possible for both sides to perish together. Han Sanha's words were not empty talk. Fu Baogua was well aware of this. After a moment of silence, he said, Marshal Han, you've seen it clearly. However, it's meaningless to do so. It'll only increase the losses of both countries. Han Sanha said, that's why this old and useless one is waiting here, planning to have a good talk with Marshal Fu. Why don't both countries call a truce now and leave everything for the future? What do you think? Fu Baogua said calmly, I'm listening. Even if it's a truce, there should be details of it, shouldn't there? Han Sanha said, the current situation is unusual, let's skip over the details. Our men will retreat to the original border of both countries. The Fortress of Resilience will still belong to Yutang. I believe Marshal Fu understands that after Dongxuan's army retreats, they won't be able to attack Yutang for the time being. Both sides can, at least 10 years of breathing time. Isn't Marshal Han thinking too much? Our army has already gained the upper hand and the initiative now. Most importantly, Marshal Han needs to understand that as long as the 9 Supreme's lords show up once more, they can crush the remaining fighting spirit of Dongxuan's 300,000 soldiers. Under such circumstances, we can pursue them with our victory and chase them all the way to Dongxuan's gates, or even march straight in. Exchanging my life for the safe return of 300,000 good men, what do I, Han Sanha, have to regret? I have already made up my mind. No one is allowed to dissuade me on this matter. Anyone who dissuades me will be dealt with according to military law. I, Han Sanha, don't wish to behead my comrade before I die. Han Sanha turned resolutely after he finished speaking, not sparing Dongxian another glance. Naturally, he could not see the Dongxian soldiers behind him, all of them tearing up, unable to make a sound. Han Sanha turned to face Fu Baogua again and said calmly, this old man only has this one request, and it's also the biggest price I can pay right now. I wonder if Marshal Fu can fulfill this old man's wish? Han Sanha did not use the word, can you promise, but can you fulfill? Although it was only a difference of one word, the meaning behind it was thought-provoking. Fu Baogua understood Han Sanha's good intentions at once and could not help sighing. This renowned marshal who had dominated the continent for decades, an invincible marshal who had paved his path to God of War with mountains of corpses and seas of blood, had finally come to this step. Marshal Han, Fu Baogua sighed, I understand and understand. I am willing to fulfill your wish. He sucked in a breath and said, Marshal Han, as Tianquan's God of War, you didn't lose to Yutong. You lost to Dongxian, not on the battlefield, but under Dongxuan's layers of restraint. Therefore, your loss doesn't involve the battlefield, you're still the undefeated God of War. The only thing I can do is to fulfill your last wish. Han Sanha stared at Fu Baogua and said softly, Marshal Fu, it's better if you don't agree so readily. This is a serious matter, and as the person directly involved, you bear the greatest responsibility. Do you think you can shoulder this responsibility? Fu Baogua smiled and said, I know about this, of course. However, I don't want to see Marshal Han's ending be too bleak. As a fellow militant, this is the last respect I can give to Marshal Han, to the continent's God of War. Although we're enemies and we stand on opposing sides, I, Fu Baogua, am determined to shoulder this. Fu Baogua's smile was sincere and filled with regret. Han Sanha stared at him and finally sighed, Fu Baogua, what a talent you are. As a general, daring to take responsibility for what you've done is courage, being decisive in battle is charisma, strategizing is strategy, being clear-minded is wisdom, knowing when to advance or retreat is the way to conduct oneself. Fu Baogua, you're considered a well-rounded talent. Fu Baogua replied calmly, Marshal Han, you flatter me. Han Sanha sighed softly and suddenly turned to look at Yun Yang, saying softly, young Master Yun, if anything happens in the future, I hope that young Master Yun can take care of the Han family a little. Yun Yang was taken aback and said, I don't quite understand Marshal Han's words. Yin Yang was not pretending to be knowledgeable. Han Sanha was Dongxuan's man after all. Was what he had just said a last-minute request? But, was it possible to do so? It was impossible. Han Sanha smiled faintly and said, young Master Yun doesn't need to understand. Just remember this old man's request. Everything will be clear in the future. Yin Yang frowned and said in deep thought, if so, I'll agree to it. Han Sanha chuckled and said, young Master Yun is a noble descendant of heaven. There is no one in this world who can be more blessed than young Master Yun. Since I've agreed to it, it's even more so to show my righteousness. This old man has nothing else to worry about. I have no regrets after this. He cupped his fists and bowed solemnly. Thank you, Marshal Fu. Thank you, young Master Yun, for fulfilling my wish. Before his words echoed in the air, Han Sanha took a few steps back and turned abruptly. Looking at the worried Dongxian soldiers who were about to dash out, Han Sanha said loudly, pass down my order. Yes, sir. Retreat immediately. Don't stop along the way. Head straight for the capital. This war ends here. This order takes effect immediately. Once he finished speaking, he drew his sword with a clang, his resolve clear. Teacher. Zhang Ge was shocked, no longer caring about the military order as he sprinted forward like his life depended on it. The clouds in the sky changed colors as the cold wind howled. Han Sanha's robes fluttered in the wind as if they were about to be blown away by the wind. He waved his hand lightly, but Zhang Ge stopped in his tracks as if he had been struck by lightning. Tears streamed down his face as he cried out sorrowfully, Teacher. Han Sanha smiled faintly and recited softly, a lifetime of battles between heaven and earth, a command like a mountain chills the bones of the dead, a year of hunger on the battlefield swallowing snow, unable to return to my homeland even after 10 years, a lifetime of settling the affairs of an emperor, a grand ambition to unite the land. As he recited, he suddenly chuckled sadly and murmured, I can bear to cook the hounds. When the hares are dead, I have no regrets when the birds are dead, I only lament that before the grand ambition is fulfilled, the heart of the emperor and his officials is already cold. I've marched thousands of miles out of the desert, donned 1,000,000 armors and fought fiercely. The demons and monsters have been wiped out, the mountains and rivers can be seen from now on. It's hard to look back on my 7-foot body. This old man's tears are speechless. Today, I repay the world with my life. I'll let my corpse return on horseback. Han Sanha heaved a long sigh and said sternly, Your Majesty. Before he could finish his words, he did not continue. The sword light flashed and blood appeared immediately. Blood gushed out from his neck like a fountain, dyeing the mountains and rivers red. Han Sanha stood tall with his sword in one hand, unmoving as the two armies clashed against each other. He did not move. The god of war of a generation had left the underworld in this lifetime. Teacher, Zhang Gu howled in pain, suddenly falling to his knees on the ground as if he had lost his soul, tears and snot streaming down his face. Marshal. A deafening cry came from Dongxuan's formation, countless men in the army weeping like rain. Yin Yang and Fu Baogua could not help sighing inwardly as they looked at Han Sanha's body that was inches away from them. Han Sanha was still standing tall despite the fact that his breath had stopped and his life had left his body. His expression was still indifferent, his eyes still looking forward as if he was stroking his beard with a smile. The sword in his right hand gleamed coldly, stained with blood. However, the feeling it gave was still that of the god of war of a generation giving orders from the marshal's tent. Chapter 518. These few days, I only wrote 500 words a day, 1,000 words a day, and sometimes 2,000 to 3,000 words. I've saved up these chapters and I'll publish them all today. Let's enjoy ourselves first. Let's talk about tomorrow. Haha. Thank you for your patience and company. Feng Ling is deeply grateful. These days, I think, should be a period of time that I will never forget for the rest of my life. Especially after the surgery, the days when I was blindfolded, it was the most memorable. Just looking at it with one eye, even the phone screen looked blurry. Talking and laughing every day, my heart was anxious. It wasn't easy to remove it, and when I looked at it, my vision was so clear. Don't worry. Haha. In the beginning, when the doctor said it was serious, I was also panicking. Ever since I started writing, it has been 10 years, and I have never stopped writing for such a long time. Sometimes, I would let my imagination run wild, thinking that when Master Xing retired, everyone would say that they owed him a movie ticket. If I, Feng Ling, was really blind, and had no choice but to retire from this industry, who knows how many people would still remember that they once owed an author a subscription fee? Luckily, no one. After not writing for more than 20 days, I'm back. Since I'm back, I'll continue to work hard and do my own thing. During this period of time, my brothers and sisters have been worrying about me, supporting me, and the managers have all sent screenshots to me. Some asked anxiously, some directly went to the hospital from thousands of miles away, and many brothers and sisters sent nourishment products. To be able to meet all of you in this life, it's my great happiness. How can I give up this happiness so easily? I've also thought that since I have 7 or 8 chapters in stock, I might as well slowly publish it and rest more, but thinking about it, everyone is so good to me, why should I hold on to it? I might as well publish it all and let everyone enjoy it. I'll talk about the future in the future. In short, I'm back. My eyes haven't recovered yet, and in the next 3 to 6 months, I'll try to avoid washing my face. I can't drink or eat spicy food. I'll take note. Maybe after today's explosion, there will be fewer updates in the future. But I'll try my best to write. When the time comes, I hope everyone can understand and understand. Thank you. My dear brothers and sisters, it's so good to stand side by side with all of you in this world again, that you're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.